Hello, beautiful people. Welcome, one and all, to this meta discourse stream on Dungeons and Dragons, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, perhaps further editions of it, though my expertise does not extend in any way beyond the first edition, which explains why we have these many guests with us this afternoon, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. This is an idea that Charlemagne came up with. So he's going to be something of a co-host. He was instrumental in putting this whole thing together. We are also joined by Skeptical Waves. Check out his audiobook channel. He's got all kinds of stuff that he puts together for people. So if you want to listen to neo-reactionary texts in audio form, you can find it there. He's a selfless laborer for that cause. We're also joined by Rick Stump. He has been running a continuous campaign for near on half a century at this point. I believe it's at 42 years, at 43 years, something like this. Rick's politics are something I know nothing about. He's not here in a political capacity. He's kindly joining us as a subject matter expert, and he's got that very well in hand. But on his part, his presence is no endorsement of anybody else's politics here, neither expressed nor implied. We're very happy to have him in his capacity as a super knowledgeable person regarding D&D. And finally, we have the man from the land of pitmen and border reavers, Morgoth. Yeah, we are very happy to have him here. He probably requires no introduction, but if by any chance it seems unlikely there's anyone who has not heard of his channel, please do check it out and consider following him here. You can do it on YouTube. You can do it over on Telegram. And indeed, check out everybody's channels. There is a blog for Rick Stump. You can find links for that as well as for everyone else's channels down in the description. Other than that, please follow my channel, Semiagog, as well as a safer space. You can do that on YouTube. You can do it on both channels on YouTube. You can do it on BitChute. God help you, since it usually doesn't work. I hope you will certainly follow me over on Odyssey, which is a promising platform. I know that many of these guys are over there as well, or at least some of them. What else? Minds, Gab, Twitter. You know the drill. There's also my science fiction book and my book of poems. You can find links for that down in the description. And thanks, as always, to this channel's patrons. All of the credit and none of the blame. So, Mr. Charlemagne, how would you like to start this thing out? I was thinking perhaps we could just sort of go around the circle, maybe starting with Rick, to just sort of establish a definition of what the hell D&D is, and perhaps, you know, more broadly, tabletop role-playing games in general, just to provide some context for people who might not know as much about the game. I know Morgoth is not a D&D guy. What do you think of that?
Why don't I give a little quick intro first, and then I like where you're going with this.
Sure.
So before we get to Rick, basically the idea to assemble the stream came to me just sort of randomly through some interactions on Twitter. And I realized that Dungeons and Dragons is very interesting in that the game is very much a living tradition and culture on its own. It's different than other games because what Dungeons and Dragons is very much defined by how it's played in this very living way. It's not purely a codified game. If you look at the rule books, they give you a set of rules, but they don't exactly tell you how to play. And so through my own understanding of the history of the game, I thought it might be interesting to sort of apply some of the ideas we talk about in regards to our own civilization and culture, especially in terms of Spenglerian or Evolian decline, and try and apply these to the actual game of Dungeons and Dragons. And when I say game, I'm more interested actually in, as the title of the stream suggests, the meta discussion around how it's played more than the rules itself. So I want to try and follow a Socratic approach here, and hopefully if I ask the right questions to people with the right expertise, we can have some interesting things happen in this discussion. So with that, I'll pass it to Rick, where he can get more into what the game actually is for people who may or may not be familiar with it.
Sure. That all sounds more than fair. Defining Dungeons and Dragons is something that seems to be slipping away from people, so I'm glad you started with that. Let me go ahead and do the punditry thing. Dungeons and Dragons is inseparable from where it came from. This is true for most games, let alone most cultural phenomenon. Wargaming has been around for a very long time. It's been popular for a very long time. And it really had a huge flowering in the United States in the 60s, especially in the Midwest, Twin Cities, Wisconsin, Duke University, I should say, all the way over in the East Coast. And in the midst of this synergistic effect of lots of people going into board games, lots of people doing war games, lots of people adding diplomacy. The board game diplomacy is a way of negotiating whether things work right or not and putting in variant rules. A gentleman started playing something called Braunstein, and it was a typical, the French are coming, the Germans are here, Napoleonic, but there was a town called Braunstein, and he set up some people where their job was to play the mayor and the baker and the butcher and the chief of the guards and a fishwife, etc. And they played them preparing the village, and the village would have changes wrought on it based upon their actions. So the battle would play out differently when they got to the battle. And he found out that people were spending a lot more time and enjoying that a lot more than they were the miniature fight. And it grew out from that. And pretty soon you had Dave Arneson started something now called Blackmore, where he started taking similar rules of it's one-on-one, you control one guy, and started adding elements of magic and science fiction. And this slowly but surely grew into D&D. Gary got involved early on. Then they were contacting people like Lou Pulsifer. Lou Pulsifer, I think, is the first person outside the playing circle who they contacted because, of course, even then he was one of the world's best respected game designers and board game designers. And he was running a gaming magazine. And so you had a lot of input from a lot of areas. So it's one of those things that I hate to say it's shaped like itself, but a tabletop role-playing game is itself. It is an outgrowth of wargaming that involves individual characters rather than groups, is probably the best definition you're going to get that's going to cover the entire field of what RPGs are now, especially now when they've grown and they've got science fiction, you've got Westerns, you've got horror. It is effectively a war game where you're controlling individual characters, and that's
pardon me.
That's the bedrock. You can go up from that. There's elements of group action. There's elements of mythological participation. There's elements of folkloric development and character development. But at the same time, and I will say this, and this is something that people get very aggressive about, it is not a writing event. It is not, in my opinion, a traditional storytelling system. Traditionally, the basics and the origins of role-playing games is there is no plot, there is no planned resolution, there is no planned heroic death. Things happen. It's very much like real life, so that narrative is emergent, not descriptive.
Yeah, I was going to throw in that bit. I heard it years ago. It was probably like someone opining in a letter in Dragon Magazine or something.
Oh, sure.
I can't remember where I heard it, but it was the basic idea that it's essentially a random fiction generator. If there is,
right. Absolutely,
if there's anything about it that is related to storytelling, it's the product, not the process. I mean, it's, you're a part of it, you're participating, you're interacting, but the important piece is that there's some sort of shared participation in the creation of whatever this storyline is that emerges from it. And it can go in any direction, depending on some player getting a wild hair up his ass and saying, no, I'm going to go do this.
Well, it's interesting because we say player and we say action. It was pointed out to me recently. I think this, and I told them I was going to steal it. It's like sports. In a way, it's a sport. And just like sports journalists will sit down after the season is over and write a book, and the book is the story of that previous season, that's only evident afterwards, right? Nobody was sitting there going, well, it's time for us to throw this game so that they can have a dramatic come from behind victory. Nobody thinks like that. Now, that happens to happen, and they have the dramatic come from behind victory. Oh, they're going to write a story about the underdogs. But if they don't have a come from behind victory, the favored people win. And that's the way it is. So if you're talking about the stories that come out of role-playing games, it's very much like sports journalism. It's something that you use to describe the action after it's over.
And it seems that there's also sort of a dimension that relates to prescriptive arrangements, and also the idea of the random. So, if, for example, you look at chess, in a fundamental way, there's something about it that's really just combinatorics. Now, of course, I'm smashing it down to the most simplified presentation, not doing it justice, but that's precisely the reason why you could have something like Big Blue defeat some famous chess player, because at the end of the day, they can crunch the numbers within that framework of combinatorics. However, when you introduce the aspect of the random, this is something I always talk about as the difference between like a Turkish backgammon player and a German chess player. They're very different psychologies, because the Turks are going to be riding the dice and playing games and trying to cheat and the rest. The whole thing with the tabletop role playing and the Dungeons and Dragons more so is that it steps out of the prescriptive framework, though there are some guidelines. It introduces the randomness that you see with the throwing of the dice, but it also has this aspect of the participatory creation, the idea of the whole that's greater than the sum of its parts.
That's exactly how I describe the game to people I talk to about it who haven't played before, as collaborative storytelling, or as a group doing stories.
This is really interesting to hear you guys.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I guess we're a little delay. It's really interesting to hear you guys discuss this. Oh, and also, I'll pay attention to chat on this video as well. So if anyone wants to bring up some points in chat, feel free to do so. But it's interesting to hear you guys discuss this mode of playing, because in some ways it's antithetical to, or not antithetical, but counter to some of the ways I've experienced a game like Pathfinder, especially when I play a campaign setting. So for people not in the know, basically you can sort of freewheel it in terms of running the game and come up with your own campaign setting or narratives that you're going to run with, and play it, or even play it more organically. Or you can buy these prepackaged books that basically give you a storyline that you play through. And in my experience, playing through a large portion of the Rise of Runelords campaign at Pathfinder, I've often found that my character, the organic aspects of my character that I was role-playing, would bump into the borders of the game world, because you're basically on this set narrative that you're sort of supposed to play along with, which actually limits your creativity in terms of what you can do with the character, because it's very easy to go outside of bounds. And you're very, as a player, you understanding that there is a boundary that you're supposed to stick with, because you're not supposed to do things that are sort of going to take you outside of where that campaign is supposed to go. I can think of one particular example. In the Rise of Runelords, I was kind of disappointed with the writing, because it feels like it's very much written like a video game, in that when we would reach what we would call a boss encounter, the boss would sort of start going on this narrative spiel like a cartoon bad guy. And what would happen is my character would often just attack him, because my character, who just went through this very dangerous trial of combat, really has no reason to just sort of stand around surrounded by a bad guy's minions and just let him give a spiel. It's totally unrealistic. And trying to actually roleplay my character as he would actually be in this circumstance ended up sort of derailing the campaign, because our characters would miss out on critical information that the bad guys are supposed to be narratively giving to us, but we weren't simply sitting there silently like it's a cutscene listening. So that's one of my experiences that sort of differs from some of what you guys described there in terms of the organic nature.
Can I ask?
What you're explaining is really common. I think that one of the biggest losses to TTRPGs over the last 45 years is there's been a great deal of loss of the culture and knowledge about how it's to be played, and we've ended up with this. It's more that somebody is a playwright and they're wanting people to be actors that hit their marks and say their lines with conviction. Yeah.
Right, like a script reading. Yeah,
Mhm,
exactly. I
mhm.
hadn't thought about that. But you know, when you've got a screenplay and you sit down with actors to do a reading to just see how it flows, yeah, there's that sort of flattened, prescriptive, social engineering, notion to it, where you're sort of locked in. Before we go forward with all of these threads, and I don't want to limit them in any way, I just wanted to ask, since we have Morgoth here, and he's not a D&D head. What was, I mean, I know you probably looked at a couple things before the stream or whatever, just to get basically familiar, but what did all this seem like to you from the outside? What was filed in your mind under the rubric of D&D before coming on this stream? What was it to an outsider?
I was vaguely aware of a cartoon, an old cartoon in the 80s or something like that. But then, I don't understand about the tabletop games and like throwing dice for your move. I don't know anything about it. I think I'm here because I've played around with the idea of applying like a Spengler's morphology to fictional worlds, and to see if I did like a video on Star Wars and about like, does it hold true that there's a cycle effect to these kinds of fictional worlds and these kinds of things. So that's kind of like my interest in, and I'm a bit of a nerd. I just don't know much about tabletop games, but that's my interest. I think that's why I'm here.
And to build on that a little bit, the really interesting thing here in relation to what you said is that D&D isn't really even a fictional world so much as it's a real world with real people in it that are playing the game. There's these sort of micro worlds inside of them, but Dungeons and Dragons itself is actually, it's very much its own real culture in the world. It isn't even fictional, which I think is what makes this all the more interesting.
Going meta on the meta. So on the one hand, we can look at the arc of a cultural trajectory, from this perspective of Spengler, like Morgoth's talking about, and then you can sort of look from macrocosm to microcosm to see if you see it reflected in the game. And certainly with all the pausing of it, or the introduction of the social justice and the various things that have been going on, it would seem that is the case.
Well, and one of the things I talk about when I try to train people to play is there's a few cornerstones about how I was taught to play and how I learned to play very early on when the game was really, really new. And one of them is something that I call verisimilitude. And that is the things inside your campaign have to make sense. And that involves the people, the NPCs. That means that, for those of you who are not in the know at all, the dungeon master or game master controls everyone who's not controlled by a player. And they're called NPCs. They should be doing things in the background. I was recently reading a contemporary product about D&D, and the descriptions was literally, when the players get here, this is what they will be doing. Doesn't matter if it's in 6 hours, 6 days, or 6 years. When you arrive, it's like a cutscene in a video game. In a living campaign, the verisimilitude means your heroes and your villains, your good guys, your bad guys, your tailors, your butchers, have plans and they're following through on them, and you have to track them through time. And if the players miss it, they miss it. And I've had actions by NPCs in my campaign. The players never did what it took to find out about them, never stopped them. They went on, they had victories off screen, as it were, and the players then had to deal with the consequences. And it's very much like you said, it's like a microcosm. It develops this dynamism of its own, and it starts to run on its own very soon. And that was always thought that's how it's supposed to be early on. And it's interesting because on the one hand, I hear people say, nowhere in the AD&D books does it tell you how you're supposed to run a campaign. But I strongly disagree, because I think that there's basically 3 pages that tell you everything you need to know to build this sort of dynamic campaign and then have a game last. Like you mentioned earlier, my main campaign is 42 years old. I started in 1979, and it's still running. And it has no intention. I have no intention of stopping it. Some of my children already have the notes, so that after I die, they plan on continuing it. So,
That's an epic campaign.
It is.
A multi-generational epic campaign. The House
yeah,
of
I've got
Stump.
second generation players in the game. Second generation people playing the game are in the game, and some of the original characters aged out and died of old age inside the game universe since we started playing. So, and it's interesting because it lends itself very much to the human desire that you see reflected in literature, adventure literature, the universal human desire to do good, to embrace the objective nature, not a notion of good, to reject objective evil, to be heroic, whether it is in combat or in thinking, the desire to build rather than to destroy. And you really see that inside the game a great deal, especially when you have a broad dynamic campaign where the players decide what's going on and they're not being told, all right, in scene 3, act 4, this is going to be happening. And you see people learning over time that the game can allow them to, in a very safe way, explore themselves and see what's best about themselves. And I find that to be one of the best parts of the game long term.
This sort of touches on one of the notes I had about the idea of esotericism and creativity versus codification, which I think gets into Spengler's culture versus civilization distinction. And so I'm losing my train of thought now. Wow, I lost my train of thought there. Oh my god.
Well, I'll throw one in while you.
Oh, okay. Here it was. So sorry. The way the game was played, or when I first started playing the game, it felt like the dungeon master sort of had access to basically esoteric knowledge, right? Like this campaign is being run, and I don't know all of the things or intricacies or ways in which the world works, and all the things that are in store for me. And I think the way the game works now is like everyone has access to all of the books, and there's no sense in which the dungeon master is really like a priest who sort of has esoteric knowledge about the game world. I mean, you could run it that way, but I think it's less and less that way.
The scripture is available in the vulgar tongue instead of just Latin, right?
Yeah, exactly. Especially this is somewhat literally true, right? From my understanding, when the game was originally created, it was very exclusive in terms of the print run was very small, and you might not actually have all the books, and in many cases the dungeon master might be the only one with the dungeon master's guide. We should point out that the game is essentially divided into like 3 core books, which is the player's handbook, which tells players how to play. It has the dungeon master's guide, which tells the dungeon master how to do his job, and the monster manual just sort of has a repertoire of creatures you can deploy. And
bestiary, it's a bestiary, yeah.
Bestiary. And once as a player, you read all of these books and even run your own campaigns as a dungeon master, some of the mystique evaporates from the world, and the world in your view becomes more this codified entity that sort of runs like a computer program rather than as this real living vibrant thing.
That's an interesting insight. I don't think I've ever heard somebody approach it that way. I can see how it could become that way. I'm going to counter, though, that my current players, there's 6 of them, and we have a rotating group of 6 guest players, so total 12 players, 6 full-time. Many of them run this game and other games and know them very well, but I'm able to maintain a sense of esoteric mystery simply because knowing the basic rules and how it works is more akin to physics in the real world. And that's just the background. There's a lot going on that they don't understand. They don't understand where certain things come from, where certain things do. And indeed, inside the campaign, there's been a catchphrase for many years: "Don't trust Rupert." And they're repeated amongst themselves often as a sort of good luck ward. And this is going to be really inside baseball, the campaign. There's what I call a super dungeon. There's a dungeon in the campaign called Skull Mountain. It goes tremendously deep in the earth. It spreads out. They've been 40 miles underground, 50 miles underground through the caverns. I've been running this thing since 83, I think, 82, 83, and it just gets bigger and bigger. So you think of a movie dungeon, and yes, there's goblins and there's trolls and there's places that shoot fire, and there's horrible little creatures that stab you in the ankles and run off in the dark. Yes. But at one point, they found a secret area, went in, and when the fluorescent lights came on and they were looking at the coffee pot and the vending machine in the break room of the area they found, they went over, found the barracks rooms, slid one of the beds aside looking for stuff, and scrawled on the wall, it said, "Never trust Rupert."
That's some very deep lore.
Very deep lore. Never trust Rupert. And they knew that another player character had left that there at some point in the past.
Actually, in gameplay, not just
during gameplay. I did not put that there. Back in the 80s, another player had scratched that there, and they knew that that was from player action, and that has become their catchphrase for, in their opinion, we will never know everything going on inside the campaign, the Seaward campaign.
And yet there's that sense of people having come before and
right. There's this, people have been there before. They find the dead. They see evidence. They find notes from players that are, my good friend Dave, God rest his soul, passed away 2 years ago from cancer. And they found some of the stuff that he left here back in the 80s. They see stuff that Lou Pulsar left there in the late 80s, early 90s. And this builds up, and they still don't know the underpinnings. And then you can also do little things, tiny little things, like make your own beasts and monsters that aren't in the monster manual, so they don't know what they do. Making your own spells, your own magic items. So you can. It's at a certain point, it falls upon you to make your world esoteric and, frankly, a bit spiritual, to maintain that sense of awe and wonder. As a matter of fact, if you guys don't mind, I'd like to read you a little something, if I can find it again. Let's see if I've got it here. It should be right here. This is from the Dungeon Master's Guide. Well, I'm going to read you two things in a second. It's from the Dungeon Master's Guide. And this is Gary talking about how the game should be played.
Which edition is this?
AD&D First Edition.
Okay.
The only edition.
Well, it's the best one. All right. And at some point, even the stay-at-homes will be forced to venture forth in the wilderness due to need, quest, or to escape the wrath of something better avoided. The timelines of various player characters will diverge, meet, and diverge again over the course of game years, making interesting campaigns. It helps form a history of the milieu. Groups of players may tend to segregate themselves for a time, some never returning to the ken of the rest, most eventually coming back to reform into different bands. As characters acquire henchmen, the better players will express a desire to operate some of their henchmen independently, while they or their liege lord are away. This is a perfectly acceptable device, for it tends to even out characters in the game, and then henchmen becomes associates or rivals. A few will remain a colorless servitor. Time is so important because it causes difficulties of record keeping. It gives players yet another interesting set of choices and consequences. And that's, in this section of time. And what he's explaining there is part of the reason you keep close track of time in the game. As your characters are busy doing something, if you're keeping close track, if Group A, and we're going to have to sail across the ocean, it's going to take 3 months. 3 months of the game time goes by. There may be something else to do. So they'll have other characters. People have multiple characters. So it's more like, I call it jazz band adventuring. The guys will sit down and say, hey, next time we're going to go to Timberlake and we're going to take these people and we'll see you there in a week. Right. And another thing that drives a sense of mystery is my players are really in charge. I don't sit down and say, okay, I wrote this adventure, so this is what we're doing tonight. There's nothing else to do. At the end of a session, they sit down and say, okay, based on the rumors we've gotten and what we learned, next time we play, we're going to go here and bring these people. So I'm reacting to them. And that lack of stage prep, that lack of treating it like a play, means I have to be reactive. But it also means that you can't suck the joy out of the world, because there's a lot more people writing this world than I am. They are. When they decide, hey, I really hate traveling to and from the dungeon and bringing all this food and water. I'm just going to make my own level in the dungeon and hide my own food and water in there. I'm going to live there while I go in and out. Right? That's happened 3 times in 3 different decades in my game. They're like, no, I'm just going to build my own level. And eventually they leave, it gets abandoned, or maybe it's discovered by monsters, maybe it's not. Other players come in and find the break room and the coffee pot, and they don't know what's going on, right? And because the players are in the background doing things and changing things, you can never sort of suck that mystery out of it unless you work really hard.
Thank you for that. So let's see. I heard Morgoth about to pipe up there for a second.
Yeah, go ahead, Morgoth.
Yeah, because obviously I'm kind of the person who doesn't know about any of this. And Semiagog mentioned chess before. Now, as far as I'm aware, there isn't like a central authority who owns chess. So it's, if you look at the rules of chess, nobody can say that they own chess and that we're suddenly going to change the rules so that we take out the knights and put in more bishops or something like that. So it's more like chess is just understood universally and its rules. So is that what D&D is like, or is there a central authority that can change things?
You both. The vast majority of people buy the games and own them. For example, I've owned my first edition books since they came out. I've replaced them a couple times. But I can do what I like with the rules. I can change them. I can modify them. There's not much you can do to stop me. But they are up to the 5th edition now, and the company that owns the copyright continues to put out changes and modifications. There's knockoffs. There's people that have the RC Cola of D&D, where it's very, very similar but slightly different. And there's other stuff. There's stuff set in space that uses completely different basic rules. There you can play superhero games. So it's this weird situation. There is a central authority, but once you buy the books, there's nothing they can do to enforce that sort of central authority.
And on top of that, the books tell you explicitly that you can change the rules to your liking. Basically it's a set of guidelines designed by experts for you. But if you want to change any particular thing, you're actually free to do so. So it exists kind of in both places at once. But of course, the central authority and the way the rules are written by that central authority will define how most people, especially new players, actually end up playing, because most people aren't going to totally rewrite the rules.
And there's the sense of having internalized them and understood them and be able to, swim within them without, being fully conscious of them because you've internalized them. And this brings to mind another sort of meta parallel that I think we can draw. And that is this business of sort of improvising and riffing and jam sessions as a genuine musical tradition, but one that is entirely distinct from the Western tradition of a conductor and a score. Because with this gameplay, you have a collaborative process going on with various players. There is a product for the game, which can be described in various ways. It is at a minimum the aggregate experience of everyone who played it, being able to talk about it over time. But in that it is essentially a collaborative process between these people, you have to look at, for example, producing music as a group, and those two paths kind of fork off in either direction. In the one sense, you have my friend Gerard, who's big into music. He's been on the channel a few times. He likes to talk about internalizing musical forms. So I studied flamenco for a long time, and it's not like you pick up the flamenco score. You can find transcriptions or tablature or whatever of a piece that was played by Paco de Lucia or something, but the living tradition of it actually is a set of basic forms which are then improvised upon. But the fundamental rules, for example, the rhythm that keeps everybody together, that can't really be changed. And that is a very distinct thing from the business of having a score with a conductor and the sort of textual Western tradition of the text as the archetype, as the governing thing that everyone must follow. Even in certain ways, the conductor himself is constrained by the score for whatever piece he's conducting. He can do some things about, maybe having the entire orchestra tuned to a different, hertz or whatever. You can do things like shifting the tempo or changing how certain things come together. But there's that lack of ability to crack it wide open in certain respects that you see with improvisation. So those two parallel courses would seem to apply to this somewhat.
Yeah, this actually gets me thinking along the lines of like tabula rasa, basically. I mean, everyone's, born free and you can do whatever you want, right? But that's not exactly true, because you're born into a culture. You're born with a particular a group of people. You're born, into an existing civilization. So like, while on a technical sense, you could break any particular boundary, those boundaries still exist in some sense, even though if, in an absolute sense, you could actually go beyond them.
Take that, Hobbes. No, you're absolutely correct. And the thing is what you see is this beautiful sort of creativity that emerged immediately when D&D created TTRPGs. Within months, people were making their own things. And some of them were radically different. Some of them are very compatible. Some of them are wildly incompatible. And that continues, and I don't think that's ever going to stop. Now you have role-playing games stretching out. It's like card games. Whist birthed a lot of card games, but man, Canasta is a different thing. And this growth is going on, but there's a certain core strength, I think, to D&D, especially AD&D, that rests upon the fact that the people who wrote it, particularly the guy who wrote it, had a deep understanding of the culture that spawned it. And that bedrock of culture and his understanding of it shines through both implicitly and explicitly, and makes the game itself, in a way, I guess, more culturally stable. That's a fuzzy way of putting it. But the fact of the matter is the game continues to be popular. It continues to sell, even as other versions come and go. It's wildly influential. And frankly, one of the things I find most interesting about it is it's amazingly understood. I believe that very few people who have played AD&D have actually read all the rules throughout time, and it shows. And I don't think it necessarily meant that they enjoyed it any less, but I think it led to this drift away from the core concepts and culture, so that by the time you get to even second edition, you have Gary wasn't involved in that one. Then you have such statements as, well, don't really bring along henchmen, they're just going to distract from everybody. There's several times in the original henchmen are critical, you have to have them eventually to play them, and then later, no, they're bad, don't use them. And I don't think that was a realization of something new. I think it was a loss of the culture and a loss of understanding what they were there for and how they were to be used.
So this is. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say this is actually very Spenglerian. It's because there's a certain morphology, there's a certain spirit to the game which is understood, and there's a certain amount of potentialities and that it has and that it can be, and there's sort of other things that it just can't be. So he draws on Goethe's sort of morphology, and they'll speak a lot about plants and trees. So as a seed, say an oak tree, it has like almost an infinite number of shapes that it can be, as long as it's an oak tree. And so they spend like pages. It's typical German kind of thing where they spend pages and pages and pages, like sort of discussing when does it stop being an oak tree, because the form will always be an oak tree. So what they're trying to say is that this will be the spirit, and it's gonna extend itself into the potential that it has and explore all of its potentialities before eventually it'll calcify and sort of stagnate. And that's what would be the civilization phase. And so the culture phase is the bit where it's extending branches and roots through the floor and seeing what kind of potential it has. But its destiny is set right from the start. Which is where
I'm about to say, Decline of the West was a heck of a read, and I was very gripped when I read it. And I can see that we may very well be in a cultural phase about that. But what I think that I enjoy, at least in my own life, is as a sort of sport or performative activity. Tabletop role-playing games are very interactive, very performative. I think that can be staved off a great deal. Simply because, like, every summer there's a couple new guys coming up to the big show in MLB. You can keep this going as long as you maintain anchors to the culture and the concepts that led to it. I could be wrong. We'll see. I do know that, and will fully admit that things that I took for granted that quote unquote everybody knew who was playing when I was 11 and 12 are basically hidden knowledge now, secret history. There's a gentleman named Jeffro Johnson who is doing a wonderful job sort of as an archaeologist of this. I was 9 when I started playing AD&D and 11 when I started my campaign. And there's a section in the back of it called Appendix N. And I think that, Morgoth, you'd like this. Appendix N is an explicit list of these are the works of fiction that impacted us when we were making this game. Short story by short story, book by book. That's a storied list. And at that age, 11, I read them all. I read all of them that were on the list. I was familiar with all of them. And I'm like, well, of course it makes sense. This makes sense. Makes sense. I can see where this impacted that. Now it helps me understand how this is supposed to work. That cultural knowledge was there at my fingertips. That was a little unusual. My father was older and he was a huge pulp fan and very big into things like pulp literature, classic literature. I was reading chivalric romances like Orlando Furioso as a kid and those sorts of things. So I had a lot of grounding there. But a few years ago, Jeff wrote a book where he went through and he tracked down and read all the things in Appendix N and put it out there. And I found out, to my chagrin, that other than my own children, none of the players I knew had ever even heard of most of those books and stories, let alone read them. And it made me realize there's this massive disconnect between assumed knowledge by the people who started playing and wrote it and people now. So when they look back and they see, well, why is it that when you cast a spell, you forget it? That doesn't make any sense. They don't have the literary anchor of this comes from this literary tradition. And here's the books it's based on. And it sort of evokes this sense of place and a sense of connectedness with a literary fictional world that to me was very evocative. Now it's very confusing because nobody knows what the heck it's about. So yeah, there's sort of it's grown up out of the canopy, I guess, and it's so easy to recognize where it's coming from or how to use it. And that's one of the reasons I would jump at a chance to come here, because I finally created an account on Twitter recently, and I found out there were 1,000 things that I just assumed everyone who played knew that most people just don't know anymore. Loss of the culture.
That's really interesting because just when I first had the idea for the stream, I realized for the first time that I might not actually know what Dungeons and Dragons is, even though I've played for years since 3rd edition, and I might not actually know how to play the game because there's actually this living tradition that I'm not connected to since I just sort of picked it up out of nowhere, which actually happens more and more now as the game is more designed, by Wizards of the Coast for the mass market. I would imagine the majority of the players by far at this point are playing something that people like yourself and Semiagog would not even recognize as Dungeons and Dragons. And I find myself wondering what is Dungeons and Dragons actually about? Is it about dungeons? Is it about dragons? Is it about the players, the setting, the narrative? Like how would any of you guys answer that question? Like what are the centerpieces of the game when you're actually playing the game?
Let me read you something else then. That's perfect timing. Thank you. All right. So this is another quote from Gary. And I'm going to abridge a little bit here. Dungeons and Dragons is not a single experience contest. It's an ongoing campaign where each playing session is related to the next by results and participant characters who go from episode to episode. As players build the experience level of the characters and go forth seeking ever greater challenges, they must face stronger monsters, more difficult problems of other sorts, and here the dungeon master must likewise increase his or her ability and inventiveness. While initial adventuring usually takes place in an underworld dungeon setting, play will expand to encompass dungeons, towns, cities, wilderness, and journeys in other dimensions, planes, time travel, alien planets, and a lot more. Players will add more and more characters to the initial adventure as the milieu expands, so that each will eventually have several characters, each involved in some separate and distinct adventure form, busily engaged in the game at the same moment of game time. This allows participation by many players in games which are substantially different from game to game, as dungeon, metropolitan, and outdoor settings are rotated from player to player, setting to setting, night to night. Perhaps a war between players will be going on with battles fought out on the tabletop one night, and the next night the same two players will have different characters saving each other's lives in the wilderness. Each campaign will have its own distinct flavor. A good dungeon master will most certainly make each game a surpassing challenge for his own players. Sometimes, because of close interaction or other reason, two or more dungeon masters will find their games are compatible to the extent that participants in these campaigns can use the characters created in one to adventure in the other. In such cases, the dungeon masters have created a very interesting world for their milieu, will offer interesting differences and subtle shifts that will pose highly challenging problems to these players. End quote.
Okay.
You know where that comes from?
Where's that?
Page 7 of the Player's Handbook,
Oh.
first edition.
I don't
It's
think
literally-
there's nothing quite like that in the later editions, for sure.
No, there's not. And what I find fascinating is I talk to people who've played AD&D for years and years, and out of all the people I've spoken to in the last 6 months, one other that was not somebody who I taught to play had ever read it.
So I want to bring in Skeptical Waves here, and since he hasn't said much yet, and this is actually completely different than my play experience. So I imagine Skeptical Waves probably has a similar one. So let me just tell you how my game experience is, especially in 3rd edition and the game Pathfinder, which is basically a slightly modified version of Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition. So here's how it goes. My group is like, we're going to play this campaign setting or something like that. We're gonna start some new characters. Here's what I would do. I'll go on the internet. I'll research how to build the most perfect badass wizard possible, or whatever. I'm going to build this character that everyone's already figured out. He's going to be perfect, and he's just going to come in and kick so much ass. It's going to be awesome. And everyone's just coming in with these perfectly pre-built, designed characters that have been figured out 1,000 times before you. And you just sort of come into the game with this template. And then it's almost like a Marvel movie where you just have these superheroes basically kicking around and just destroying every challenge they approach. And okay, so Skeptical Waves, do you have a similar experience to that?
Mine has been a little bit different. I would say my initial introduction was at 3.5 and was closer to what Rick was describing in terms of an experience, at least of going into a completely world that was being developed in combination with the DM. Now that one didn't last very long, just for other life reasons. But of the stories I've played since, they've all been starting at first level, like starting out with fresh characters and playing in worlds that are invented entirely by the dungeon master. That is, I haven't played any canned campaigns except for the one which I was hosting as a playtest of the Pathfinder 2, like the one that was released with it.
That's a playtest thing where it has to be some experience, sure.
Yeah. So beyond that, every other campaign I've played has been from first level with new characters. We've developed a backstory of how we might know each other and such, and then we're thrown into a world, with a little bit of description from the DM of where you're starting out, like why you are where you are, to combine with your backstory, and then you're going to figure out what is actually going on. Now, what's different than Rick, I'd say, is that the DM has always had a story in mind, even if it was developed on their own, like a large overarching narrative, but we would regularly derail that and go on and end up on different places and in different paths than what was what would have been intended / pre-prepared by the DM in hopes that we would go that direction. And that, I think, has provided some pretty rich narratives as experience.
So let me just append to that as well. Like the way I've come to play the game, I actually hate it now, and I actually really want my really powerful OP wizard to just die so that I can build a more interesting character who doesn't just break the game. Because it's interesting too, because what Rick described is basically exactly how my original world is. When I was in university, I designed my own custom setting, basically exactly how Rick described it, and there's a full breathing world in the background. And basically I don't really have a plot in mind so much as there are characters, non-player characters with motives who are doing things. There are multiple groups of players in the world. And we only played this a little small amount, but it's very much designed where the players will go into the world, things will happen, and whatever comes out of it, we'll see. There's no necessary ending to this thing. There is a main bad guy, and he's doing stuff, but he could win, he could lose, some third scenario could happen. And I'm realizing that, especially from this conversation, that was actually the right way to play back when we were, I think, younger, more dynamic, more creative. And as we've played the game longer and it's become more of a routine, more codified, and you can just sort of very easily on the internet just research everything you want to do, we've kind of devolved in a way. Like the way my group actually plays the game has devolved into a more static and uninteresting mode of playing. And I kind of want to go back to this less video game-like way of playing the game.
Can I throw something in here? It has to do with it has to do with the question of whether or not the changes that we have seen take place with this game and its variants is for example the result of emergent behavior. Changes simply happen, or we can see here a natural sort of efflorescence and then decay cycle, like we'd see with something along the lines of a Spenglerian cycle, right? Or because it can be a combination of these things. Are we seeing, for example, just the influence of video games? Like, I want to take this moment to make fun of Academic Agent simply because it's fitting and proper, because he's always talking about fucking computer games as RPGs. and the idea that within that narrowly constrained combinatoric set of options with your little 3D environment, that is somehow a role-playing game. When you pick from the combinatoric choices that are presented to you, and you've got however many, 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 yields the total set of possibilities. That is not a role-playing game. So how much of it is video games coming along and shaping the expectations and thoughts about this? Of course, with video games, you don't have that organic sort of what would I call it? Sort of a fractal, constantly infolding and unfolding granularity, right? Because what Rick was talking about, you can come across anything, and with the assistance of the dungeon master, you can unfold it and have it simply open up into a whole new set of possibilities and worlds. Whereas that only happens in video game play, where that has been arranged beforehand. There are going to be a limited number of them. You can go hunt for Easter eggs or find the hidden level, but the possibilities don't unfold and multiply in the way that they do with true role-playing game play. Then the last question, because we're looking here at an arc, why are these changes happening in the game is the question that I'm asking. Why have we seen these changes over time? The last one I'll throw in is the idea of subversion. Not only do we have the idea of cycles that play out naturally, where the invivifying force in a thing wanes and dies, not only do we have sort of cross-pollination, where you come from the world of video games and people simply fail to understand what the given thing actually is, as is the case with AA, where he calls it a role-playing game. And then we've got active subversion, which we saw with Gamergate, and from rainbow-colored dragon shirts for the D&D people and everything else. It seems there's quite a bit of that going on too. And I left this. I started playing Basic in '79, and then within 6 months I was playing AD&D. I'd bought my first Dungeon Master's Guide, and I've mostly been a DM for that time or since then, but I stopped playing around like 92, and I came back like a few years back and started playing with some of my friends. Then we were setting up this stream, and I was talking to a number of people on Twitter. Several of you will have seen that exchange, and everybody seemed like they had their little panties stuck up in their butt cheeks. It was insane what the world of the D&D players had become. So sort of setting the stage in that way, the possibility of these various elements, what has happened to the game, how has it happened, and if anybody has any guesses, why?
Well, I have some strong opinions, if you're willing to hear opinions that I may or may not be able to back up. I think that one of the first things that hit was the startling revelation to the peoples that made this, that if you do have people playing the way the original people played, there's nothing to sell them, right? If you've got the basic core books, you don't need to ever buy anything else again. I mean, I replaced them, but
this is funny because just in looking around for the stream, I saw a post on Reddit where it was some guy with a picture, and he had a picture of how he had finished collecting like all 30 5th edition books or something. It's just mostly just campaigns, and I was just like, why would you do this?
Right.
What are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, one of the very first things that came out, and I remember hearing this at the time from Lou Pulsifer, where people were saying, "Hey, could you sell us a dungeon, make an event, what we now call a module?" And at TSR, like, wait, what? Why? Why would we imagine things for you? What? But then they started making.
You're basically asking other people to do the creative parts for you,
right,
and then sell it to you as a product. That's what these modules are, right? It's like
that's what they are.
And you buy from the company that owns the game some pre-built drama that you just sort of play through, and it takes away the creative element from the player.
I was going to ask Rick, so that happened right from the beginning, right? That these modules existed. So how do those differ from what Charlemagne described?
Not much at all. Not much at all. A lot of them were some of the first modules is that we'd come up with a standard adventure for a convention. People go in, the module is supposed to go, you had a scoring system so you could claim which group of people were the best group, right? And then people, I want to buy that. And then they realize, well, I can make a ton of money. On the one hand, the guys at TSR thought the creative part was the fun part. On the other hand, it was paying the mortgage, right? So they started putting out more and more modules. And then second edition really just sort of ramped that up. And you had the core books, and you had handbooks, and you had complete books, and you had what we now call splat books, because they make a splat when you throw the cheap soft covers down. And they just started putting more and more modules, more and more this, that, and the other, because it's a moneymaker. And now we're up to, with Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast, I have been told, that I can't confirm, that a great deal of the money they make is from accessories, t-shirts and mugs and dice and everything else, but they crank out a tremendous volume of product, and they often focus more on the art and binding quality than they do on the contents. Now, I don't begrudge a guy making a living, I get that, but I do think it has contributed to a financial incentive to de-emphasize how the game was originally played, and really emphasize, come in and get your script, make sure that your playwright and stage director are there, and let's hit those marks and sell those lines. Another thing that was happening is the original Dungeons & Dragons and AD&D is, and there's no way of putting this otherwise, potentially a brutal game if you're unlucky. Unlike third edition and on, where you like, well, I know that my stats are going to be this, and everyone's going to be above, all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, the kids are all above average. You could very well end up playing a guy who's below average in literally everything, but that's who you get to play, and you get to make him work. And there was always this complaint of, well, I don't want to be, the Grey Mouser's crippled brother. I want to be Fafhr's older, stronger brother who's better with the sword. So there was a lot of impetus to make vocal players happy by, frankly, making the game easier to play.
Okay, so this is something I really wanted to get into, and it's kind of an answer to Semiagog's question away, and I'm hoping Morgoth might have something to say on this aspect as well. So let me lay this out. This is from my perspective, like the view of the older rules is exactly this, that they're more brutal, less fair, kind of less fun, just because it doesn't let you do what you want to do, basically. And I feel like the original way the game was played and rule set is more just about the full breadth of experience, like you described. Mm-hmm. Third edition, I think, is a lot more focused actually on the individual and how special each individual character is and how important you are. And you have all these features to build these sort of Superman characters that are just sort of, even from level 1, are just like these gods among men. And the game is really very much about your special boy player character who might have these weird rules built around them. And then, so to me, this is kind of going from like It's kind of going from like the more priest-oriented phase of the culture to the more, I suppose, like warrior aspect of the culture. And then I think 5th edition, kind of the rules themselves are more of like rules for the mass man, because 5th edition is a lot like 3rd edition, except the rules are sort of stripped away, right? So there's almost no complexity left. It's similar to 3rd edition and how it's played, but a lot of the junk is taken away, so the rules are kind of better because they're more refined, but they're also dumbed down to the point where you can sort of just jump in and play with almost no barrier to entry. And I think I would view that as a decline in the game itself, because to me, it sort of actually reduces the full breadth of possibility that you could experience when you're so constrained to these really simple rules designed for a mass audience, as opposed to people who are genuinely part of and interested in this full experience. So does anyone have any ideas?
No, that's interesting.
Actually, let me add one more thing. I think this is actually exemplified in video games themselves with semi-agog reference, because these older video games that, Academic Agent likes to play, for example, are really complex and kind of hard to play, and there's a high barrier to entry, but they sort of offer a greater expanse of space if you're willing to engage with this difficulty curve, whereas modern games are really very much on rails, and what you would call an RPG these days is just something you scoff at, right? So I think we've seen this process. I think it's not merely a cultural phenomenon. It is actually ingrained in the way the rules have developed. I think there's a process of decline happening here, just in what the rules are focusing very much more on allowing the players to have their own like special experience, as opposed to the actual health of the game itself, if that makes any sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Matt, you were talking about this, and I was going through this in my head, and it hit me. Basically, the older rules are a lot like Sands of Iwo Jima or So Proudly We Hail, right? About a bunch of scrappy draftees out there doing their best to get ahead. And then we move to the middle phase with 3rd edition, 4th edition, and it's a James Bond movie where you've got flashier villains, but you yourself, you're good at everything, and you've got a ton of support. And now I swear 5th edition feels a lot more like Ultraman. You're a superhero, and you're facing these gigantic things, and you got all these superpowers, but it's for kids, And I think that we've lost, the culture surrounding it, the impetus to make it simpler and more broad in appeal. The idea that it's going to mirror video games so that each player feels that they're special and unique, and getting rid of the randomness that was embraced in the earlier editions, because I've heard people like, I just don't want to die because the roll of the dice. Well, you drive to work every day, you're pretty much rolling the dice then too, has led to sort of a synergistic effect, a feedback effect, where the culture is getting lost, but there's a lot of people that want it to be lost, so they make sure it stays lost. Leading that subversion thing, the discussion of subversion, I'm pretty certain that there are people who literally will say that they want to subvert older editions of D&D. They have a ton of different motives, ranging from, I didn't like it because I thought it was too complex, or I thought it was too brutal, all the way up to flavor of the week. Somebody doesn't like it. Could be almost anything. And it leads to some ridiculous stuff, like this loss of culture, the rejection of culture, subversion. I've run to people say, oh, THAC0 was so complicated. Nobody could understand THAC0. We had to have these new modern rules because THAC0 was too complicated.
THAC0 stands for?
To hit armor class
zero. It's the number, because for Morgoth here, when you want to punch a dragon in the face with a magical battle axe, you roll a d20, you add in all your bonuses, that number you give the dungeon master, and they determine whether or not you hit. And the quick way to find that out is something called THAC0, which means you need, say, a 7 to hit armor class 0. People claim it's complex. Here's how you calculate THAC0. Ready? Subtract the armor class the creature you're swinging at from THAC0. That's the total you need on your d20 plus bonuses. That's it.
And let's add in one last piece, which is very straightforward. I learned to play this game at 9.
Yeah, 9. Yeah,
9.
See, I was 9 years old.
That was basic. I think I'm just a couple of years younger than you, Rick. But by 1980, I was playing first edition AD&D, and there was a real learning curve. I was frightened to look at it at age 10. Because it was a big book, and it was Smythe's Zone and all these columns, and it was a giant hardback tome for a 10-year-old. But for anyone to suggest that it was too difficult to play when I could figure it out at 10 is just preposterous.
And it's a form of subversion. And I think there's people now that have internalized this. They've never looked. They've just been taught it's too difficult to play. And here's why I was told why it's too difficult to play. And we're 3 steps away from why. But I really do think that this started off with a subversion of, I don't like that version. Tell everybody it's too difficult, so they won't even try it and move on. So I do think that sort of subversion exists. And there's also edition wars that go on, which can be fascinating. And that's people are wedded to one edition over the other, so they'll badmouth different editions. It's Bears versus the Steelers, that sort of stuff. It doesn't really matter, but people are passionate about it. And I think that goes on a great deal. And I think that all those things have combined. Plus, bluntly, I'm going to go back to it again, the culture around us, because it does exist in the broader culture. The culture around us has changed drastically. One of the things that I find almost disheartening is the Dungeon Master's Guide, which, you talked about reading at 9, 10 years old, is a big, thick book. It's very dense. I've run into people saying, well, the real problem is Gygaxian prose because Gary invented so many words that aren't real. And when pursuing this, I found out that a lot of people simply don't know all the words in the book because their vocabulary is not what it once was. Let's put it that way. The average high school graduate now has a much smaller vocabulary than the average high school graduate in 1960. And the first wave of people making in these games, they were in their 30s. Most of them are dying off right now. The first wave of creators and early players, they're in their 70s or more older and they're passing away. But they actually had a very sort of different academic experience, a different sort of literary experience, a different TV and movie experience. Some of them were old enough that they were listening to old-time radio when they were children. So they're listening to stuff like Jack Benny and The Shadow and Suspense. And they expected people to understand those sorts of ability to narrate like they'd learned from old-time radio, and that's gone. People don't, even podcasts these days are usually not like that. It's just people talking. Old-time radio had an entire, 3 or 4 generations that were extremely verbally proficient because they were hearing detailed descriptions that were verbal only. And that's gone with the wind. And I live in Atlanta, so you can see what I did there.
So how much of this is the culture, and how much of this is the business that changed?
I think it's 50-50. I think it's 50-50.
I'm reminded of because I'm old enough to have played Final Fantasy VII when it first came out on the PlayStation 1. And it was really difficult. It was really an undertaking because the internet was like in its infancy. I didn't know anybody who had the internet back then, and you didn't have any of the law books either, which came out. And there was certain, I don't know if anybody here played it, but I logged in like hundreds and hundreds of hours on it when I was a young lad. And you, because you had to figure everything out yourself, and there was these creatures in it called the weapon creatures, which were unleashed towards the end of the storyline, and they were unbelievably difficult to beat. And then a few years passed, and I got another. I was living on my own, and then I got another PlayStation, and I bought the game again. And then somebody reeled off like a load of stuff from the internet. And it was like telling me exactly where like the Ultima sword would be, and exactly exactly what you had to do to kill the Ultima, the sort of Ultima weapon creatures, like the big bads of the whole game. And I thought it just demystified absolutely everything about it. Even though it was fun, and you think, right, I finally get to open this place up and finally get to do this. it still demystifies it all. And then in later editions of Final Fantasy, they begun to understand that there was these law books being printed. So they started doing that themselves and selling them with the game for like, you know, 20 pounds.
Yeah.
But then on top of that, they then bypassed that altogether and started to put like inventories into the game and like sort of notes and memory, like so you had it all logged in your game, and there'd be like what creatures were vulnerable to what particular magic or poison or whatever. And it seems like something very similar to what's being discussed with Dungeons and Dragons. And I mean, so that there is like a subversive, like ideological element. But I think there's also the financial one where they think it has to be, does have to be dumbed down because most people are stupid.
I've always compared it to. I feel like originally when we started playing and the games we play is in a way like you convinced the girl you had a crush on to go to prom with you, and then with all the stuff that's going on now and how much easier it's made with and like video games, lore books and cheat books, and everything else, it's more like you convince her to kiss you because she feels sorry for you. Right? You still get the kiss, but the experience is completely different.
It's an interesting story you told there, Morgoth, because I have this really particular experience with Final Fantasy VII. So, you know, me and my brother, way back in 2005, we had basically everything we owned destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, right? So we were living with my cousins for a few months, and basically our only property was a PlayStation and a copy of Final Fantasy VII that they gave us. So it was kind of just me and my brother in this room with no internet or anything, just playing Final Fantasy VII. And even though the game is very primitive and, you know, ultimately rather simple, it still felt very much like a living and very interesting and challenging world. And I remember, you know, there were times where we would spend like hours just wandering around the world map trying to figure out what the hell you're supposed to do in this game. We enjoyed it, but it's an experience you don't really have anymore in games because you would never get stuck. There would just be an arrow telling you exactly where to go, or you would just go on the internet and look up what to do. But we had to actually figure out on our own what do you actually do in this game. And, you know, you could totally miss out on things, you know, not have access to the materia. You could, you know, you can just get your characters killed. There's all kinds of bad things that could happen to you, and you just sort of had to actually critically think your way through the actual game. But that doesn't really happen anymore. And it doesn't happen so much either in a lot of the sessions I've had of Dungeons and Dragons, simply because they're sort of pre-designed for you to win, basically.
I mean, even there was, when you got to a save point, it was like it was a genuine feeling of getting to a save point so that you didn't have to replay 2 hours of game if you died suddenly out of the blue, which could happen if you went into the wrong place. There was if you wandered into a place at the far north, all of a sudden like the creatures were like way out of your league unless it was the end of the game. But there wasn't any signs saying don't go there. You'd just die. And if you hadn't saved, like, you know, that was it. It would be like an hour of gameplay left. So it was kind of built into the structure that you felt this kind of blessed relief when you got to a save point. Whereas, I mean, I don't know what they're like now, but on something like Skyrim, it basically puts you just back to where you died. There's not really any cost.
Well, and also in the Elder Scrolls, everything is leveled to the player. So no matter where you go, the difficulty is the same, no matter what point of the game you're in. The way you described Final Fantasy was really interesting there, because when I designed my own D&D world, I actually probably subconsciously designed it exactly like this, where instead of having, I guided the players by having certain areas simply be too powerful for them, and they would sort of know not to go there based on some organic process that actually happened in the world, rather than, you know, explicitly just instructing them. I mean, today too, you couldn't sell a game like Final Fantasy. People would have no tolerance for actually going through that learning curve where you lose like 2 hours of progress because you died. This actually gets into the idea of player death, which I think is interesting. So in Dungeons and Dragons, of course, your characters are very valuable because you invest a lot of energy into building their actual character, role-playing them, buying equipment and all that. But you have in the game character death, right? Your characters can be killed. And the older games tend to be more brutal in this sense. It's easier to just sort of die. But I think a lot of modern people are basically like, well, my character shouldn't just be killed by a random die roll. Like, I shouldn't just sort of randomly die unless I mess up really, really bad in some way. And even then, I find when my friends dungeon master and when I dungeon master, we're very hesitant to actually kill off a character, and we'll usually go out of our way to not kill player characters because they're treated as these very precious special objects. Whereas it feels to me like in the older games, the individual characters were just sort of treated like anything else in the game world, right? They're just these elements, and they may be disposed of if circumstances dispose of them. Whereas I think the way the modern session is played is a lot more about preserving those characters through some particular experience, because it's just too mean to actually kill off a character, right? It's just something you shouldn't do.
Well, and that's it's another point. I was always taught, and I've always played, everyone has a bunch of characters. So you would like them, but there's plenty of them. And you have henchmen. Here's an example. Sam, one of my players now, Sam, he's got 7 characters. One of them is named Clint, who is a paladin who rides a warhorse called Mule. He wears a poncho and chews a cigar all the time. He has 12 henchmen. So when he travels, it's an army. There's 13 people just for him. Now, if he were to die, he could immediately just continue the adventure with one of his henchmen, throw his body over a saddle, maybe get him brought back to life later, maybe not. If for some reason him and all the henchmen were wiped out, well, he's got 6 more characters, all of whom have 3 to 5 henchmen each, all of whom are playable. So it's a blow. It would be a blow, but it's not. You can't keep playing anymore. When you're playing, everyone has one character. You only have one character. You're supposed to play it to the end. You don't have any henchmen. If your character dies, you literally have nothing to do. It's even worse than that save point. Imagine if you're playing a video game, and when your character dies, not only just start at the beginning, you get no gear, and they've moved the map so you don't know where anything is anymore. It can be like that when you're playing just one character. So it is a huge blow. And that's why traditionally you had a bunch of them with a bunch of henchmen. Not too long ago, Jennifer's character, her favorite, was dissolved into a puddle of protoplasmic slime. And she immediately just said, okay, I'm going to switch over to my paladin henchman and keep fighting. Right? Because that's how you did it. You kept fighting, and don't worry, she got better. They fixed her. It took a little bit of a issue, but they were able to get her undissolved. But even if it had been permanent, she's like, that's a real shame, but I've got plenty of other people I can play. And I think that's one of the big differences.
This is interesting because I know there's rules in the rulebook for this, but I've never played with these henchmen, basically, where your player character sort of has a band that goes together. The band is always just your 3 or 4 like player characters, and that's basically it. You don't have these sort of NPCs in your retinue that like sort of follow you around that can substitute in. Skeptical Waves or even Semigog. I mean, do you guys have experience with this mechanic?
No, not at all.
Well, I'm a primarily a DM because I can never. I'm too picky, and so I can't ever find a dungeon master that I can suspend disbelief with. So I've always wanted to be a player and haven't had much of a chance. However, in running campaigns, the party almost always has. I mean, beyond first level, scrapplings in the dirt and magic users with 2 hit points, desperately, waiting to use their 1 magic missile spell. All the time.
Yeah.
NPCs.
So is this like in the rules? Because in the modern rules, when you build a character, like I said, there's rules for players having like henchmen, but it's in like the Dungeon Master's Guide. And when a player comes into the game, there's no sense in which they're going to build like a retinue of people.
Well, let's see. Right now, the current players I have, they've actually bound together, and they're following the rules, the medieval rules for making a free company, like the Tercios or the Landsknecht did. So they got a free company, so they're organized like a band of merchants or mercenaries, so they can travel around. You have, at last count, I want to say, 18 player characters that are members of the group. Between them, they have 64 henchmen that are in the group. And then they have a standing retinue of cooks and valets and teamsters and porters and mule drivers and mule skinners, guardsmen, spearmen, pikemen, crossbowmen, scouts, 3 cartographers. a skinner, a tanner, an ale maker, and these are the guys that travel with them.
So I didn't realize that this, because I know it evolved originally out of like kind of wargaming, where you had, I guess, an army, and so that sounds a lot closer to that style than I realized.
It's a lot closer, but that's where it came out of. So you realize when you look at the rules and you look at some of the things in the rules, it makes sense to do that, and it's mirrored in it. Again, I got some rules that are in the book that most people have never heard of that I could read later to explain it to you where it comes from. And it's also based on the conroy in the medieval period. Excuse me a second. The knights were part of a conroy. Knights did not go into battle by themselves, except for tournaments, and even then they'd have the conroy with them. The conroy were other people that were trained in weapons and fought from horseback and fought alongside them as support, flanking them, helping them up, carrying spare weapons. Depending on where you were, like in parts of the time in France, they could not fight with lances or bec de corbins, but that varied a lot. It was often, oh, sure, we can't do that. Yeah, I'm sorry, But these were often not guys with the same training as a knight or close, but they weren't capable of being a knight. They didn't have the money or the breeding, whatever the case was. And that's where the word sergeant comes from. The members of a conroy were called sergeants. My players have traditionally adopted this from history and from wargaming because conroys were used in some of the old war games back in the 60s. It's in a lot of the chivalric romances. They talk about the conroys and their sergeants. The Matter of France discusses a great deal. So, like Clint, he's just got a conroy. And the Company of the Dark Moon has all these people. And it leads to this amazing sort of play. One of the ones I like to tell people is in Skull Mountain, my big dungeon, they went in, they knew they were going to be there for a couple of days. They brought in a bunch of servants, set them up, brought down porters and guards with torches, went to another level, dropped off a bunch of food and water so they could stage deeper in and not worry about it. And then afterwards, they had a massive fight with these creatures that are basically animated skeletons covered and animated by mold, effectively. They're called Vegapygmies, but you get hit with mold and you transform into one of these mold monsters. They wiped them all out, and then they immediately sent off 2 runners who ran up and had the cleaning crew come down with mops, buckets, and strong vinegar to clean down the place to make sure the mold was wiped out. And it describes a couple things there. One, this is all on their own. They thought of this. We're going to have guys here with making vinegar and bringing vinegar, and we're going to have boiling water at all times and lye soap, and we're going to be ready to scrub things down. They thought of that. 2, it's really dynamic, and it has a lot of stuff that's going on there. And 3, it points out just exactly how paranoid I've made them in the game. And
they should always fear you.
Yes. The nickname they have for me is Rick, Not a Killer DM, Stump.
Is that like a giant guy who has the nickname Tiny?
Yes, it's just like the giant guy who's called Tiny. I dropped some examples in chat beforehand. We run a Discord server that's only for players, and one of them said, "Is it our esteemed Dungeon Master Rick, Not a Killer DM, that had us fight a 24-foot tall zombie with a Cthulhu strapped to his forearm like a ray gun?" Yes, it was. And that's part of that escalation, making things interesting. But I don't think that I could even imagine a contemporary group of players where each guy's got one person saying, "Oh, we got the resource and everything, so we can scrub this place down and make sure that the mold's destroyed." And I don't think it would occur to them. And I think that that's a loss.
So when you're bringing on new players, so I wanted to kind of transition to another meta point here. Finding and bringing on new players, how do you determine whether or not they're actually going to be a good fit in something like that? Because something we've been talking about in general is the idea of gatekeeping culture.
Well, I don't. The thing is I hate to call it gatekeeping because that implies you're keeping people out of the game as a whole, which you can't do. Anyone can buy the books. Anyone can start running it. I would say more like filtering from my table, which is Rick's way of saying, "Yeah, I'm a gatekeeper," but I do filter for the table. I find that I've had the most luck in the last 12 years. I've had the most luck with people who are currently under the age of about 26. Don't know. I think that's largely because I have a lot of children in that age range. So they are able to introduce me to a wider group of people in that age range. A lot of Gen Xers. And while I don't think it's generational necessarily, simply because I don't interact with a lot of people who are millennials. Millennials are the little girl with a little curl. When they come to my table, they're either really, really good or they're horrid. I usually I have a document I say it's called "So You Want to Play D&D with Rick," and it's a PDF, and I send it out, and it's the basic lore for the game in about 2 single-space pages, then a bunch of data dump for making a character, and a couple more single-space pages, and then just the sorts of things I expect at the table, and then we have them come in. We have some food. We sit down. We have them make a character with us in person. I have one existing player for each new player if we're doing more than one, walking them through stuff, answering questions, doing stuff. I'm not involved unless they've got a meta question. And then I just throw them into the deep end immediately.
And who do you tell to piss off? Who do you just categorically say, nah?
So far, the only person, and I'll be blunt, in the last 12 years, there's only been 2 people that I did not invite back. One of them flat out said, that was interesting, that's not how I like to play. Fine. Shake hands, part friends, good. And the other one was a young man who insisted he had a good time, but was just completely disengaged, not paying attention at all. And I appreciate. I think he was just being polite. I don't think he enjoyed himself. But in that, in the last 12 years, I've brought in about 9-10 players. Some of whom stuck around for a long time. Some of whom have only been there a few times. I'm going to be doing another rotate in with some people in the spring. It's people that are I've got a public-facing Discord for my blog that people come to. Went out there and did some stuff. That's actually going to be a game called Champions where you play superheroes. Frankly, it usually doesn't take me too long talking to you on the phone or on the internet, voice talk, maybe 3 minutes to figure out whether or not you can be a good fit once I start talking about gaming. And
it sounds like there's a considerable amount of self-selection going on in terms of who makes it all the way up to your threshold.
Absolutely. Especially since when people play with me the first time, I often don't start them at first level. I do something called hologramming, where I start them at 3rd or 5th level and give them a few little bits of extra money and gear. And I've got this spreadsheet that I use where as they earn experience points, it goes to their first level guy until they catch up. I find that they're a little less nervous if they're not first level, so they relax and learn more. Not always, but that's how I usually do it. But yeah, when I sit down and okay, here's the 9 pages that I want you to read before you start making a character, that's usually 90% of the selection.
So then how do we preserve this style of play going forward?
Well, I think we just have to keep teaching it. I think that the number of people I've spoken to, I really started proselytizing. I even came up with a nickname for it. I call it psychedelic gaming as a shorthand for the things I think are the most important elements of keeping the systems going. As I've been sort of evangelizing it very low key, it's not like I'm, taking out ads with Google or anything. I'm getting an extremely positive response. People are very much enjoying the idea. It seems easily understood. And there's other people that are talking about it. I mean, I'm not the only guy still around playing the old ways. There's another guy that campaigned about as old as mine. He's on Facebook saying much the same things I am. Jeffro Johnson had gone in. It's like he spent years saying AD&D is unplayable, and I kept saying read the rules and get back to me. He read the rules, ran a campaign for a year, and now he's very much on board with all the rules, basically all the rules of psychedelic, the psychotronic gaming, and people just seem to understand that it's going to be fun and they want to try it. And I think that just by talking about it and moving on, we can get the basics out there. But I also tell them at every time, you've got to do a lot of reading. You've got to read the stuff in Appendix N. You've got to read widely in older fiction, in particular the stuff that was being read by the guys who made the game. You've got to, I do a huge volume of reading of medieval history and literature, and always have. And that all helps. But yeah, the elements of psychotronic that I talk about is you have to keep very strict time records. Verisimilitude, the world has to have its own life and it has to make sense internally. Status quo is the enemy. When people change things, they stay changed. one thing that I've seen that I've always disliked is, oh, well, I've got this plan, see, and the evil guy's got this lieutenant. The lieutenant's going to kill the fighter at a climactic moment. That's be awesome. And then, 9 months before that happens, they curb stomp the lieutenant and leave it, loot his body and throw him in the sewers. And the game master say, "Oh darn, not gonna make a new lieutenant." No, they beat the guy. Let him earn their victory. They beat him, right? If you expected this bandit king to be a thorn in their side for 3 years and they figured it out and kill him in 4 days, they won. But at the same time, if they blow off the tails of the bandit king, maybe he'll succeed and build that fortress and control the Western Valley. And now you got to raise an army, go to war because you blew it off. So no status quo. Multiple players, multiple characters per player. Again, that makes their death not such a big deal. The DM won't let it happen. Characters can win or lose based on action and choices, right? Pretty straightforward. Players drive the action. It's not me saying, okay, next week, this is what we have to do. It's the player saying, next week, we want to do that. And the one that seems to really get to people is I say, genre must be descriptive, not proscriptive. And I think that my favorite example of when I learned to say that was Star Wars, when it first came out. I heard people, well, of course, it's not science fiction. The Force is fantasy and science fiction. No. Genre is a label to help us find new stuff we like. It is not a rule that you can't put chocolate in your peanut butter, right?
So is what people are playing now that's called D&D, even D&D, compared to what? Like, should you still be calling what you do D&D in
what
comparison? Yeah, like it was once D&D, but and what do we do about the fact that what everybody else is doing is also being called D&D?
Other than taking the fire and the sword to them.
Well, I think this is sort of like when you cross the pond and go to England for the first time and you find out that America and England are two nations separated by a common language. They have not been exposed to this, and they don't know what it is. As a matter of fact, we talked a little bit about subversion and financial incentives. I think it's been kept from them. The way I play, the way I run a game is shockingly inexpensive, right? I think that my total outlay for everything for the game in 2020 during the lockdown, when we were playing even more than normal, was about $16. And that was mainly notebooks, mechanical pencils, and pens, right? And you can get those at the grocery store. I think that it doesn't behoove any of these corporations. And frankly, I don't think it behooves people that are making the YouTube channels and the Patreons selling content. For a lot of them, not all of them, for a lot of them, it doesn't make any sense to pitch this style of play because you don't need to buy anything. You're doing it yourself. It organically grows out. The way Skull Mountain grew is all internal. I'm adding in. I actually, on my world that's been around for 42 years, I have a strict rule of I only map stuff when I have to. Right? There's no world map. When people are like, oh well, where's the capital of Rome land? About 25 days southwest. Where's France land? Oh, it's about 16 days by sea. Very vague. I don't map anything until I have to. And that allows me to be dynamic. So by the time I get there, it has organically grown up in my head and in the descriptions of the players and everything else. It's a lot easier. I don't have to go buy anything. That being said, I do have a Patreon and I do sell stuff and I appreciate that. But the stuff I make is very much in support of this psychotronic style of play. For example, I've invented new character classes for NPCs only, so you have a wider variety of henchmen, and your henchmen are capable of doing things that no player can do. Right? You
can sort of expand it and
right. I'm making it bigger for the net. I've added in some more player character classes. For example, one of the things I've always thought was interesting is in D&D First Edition, thieves can't use bows or crossbows. Okay, so you can't do Robin Hood. So I made a thief class that's similar to the thief, but is outdoor oriented, that uses bows and is good with bows rather than daggers and swords. And instead of can ambush you with the arrows rather than backstabbing you, because I wanted to have Robin Hood stuff going on. So a lot of stuff you can grow like that and you move out. I've got soldiers and they're they've got special abilities on the battlefield. So when they're commanding more than 60 troops, everything gets more efficient because they're professional soldiers, right? And you can do stuff like that. And that's why back when I was reading this to you, Gary himself said in the player's handbook.
And who is Gary for the audience?
Yeah, Gary Gygax, the guy who wrote AD&D. In the Dungeon Master's Guide and the player's handbook he's writing, when your campaign is mature, if you run into a game master where their campaign is compatible, the players can go back and forth. That's a really profound statement from the creator of the game. He firmly expected that after a few years in a campaign, your campaign will have grown and matured and changed enough that it may not be compatible for playing with somebody else's mature campaign.
That's interesting because, I mean, in my view, there's no concept in which two campaigns could ever be compatible or merge. The whole idea doesn't even make sense to me, nor does it make sense to me the idea that the players would be leading armies or marshaling armies or doing anything like that. The things the players are going to do to accomplish challenges is just like buy items, learn new spells, level up, right? You level up to...
You level up. You go to a magic shop and you buy magic items.
Yeah, it's pretty rare. Like we do this, but the game lends itself more to, if you have a challenge, you don't like sort of critically think and solve your way out of the challenge so much as just go to the correct shops or look up items and get the thing that solves the puzzle for you, basically. A buddy of mine says that in the old days, when you came into a problem, you looked up and thought. And now, when you come to a problem, you look down at your character sheet to see what it's got. Basically, that's kind of how it works. Is you look, do I have the key that opens this lock? And if I don't, where do I buy it? Like, that's basically how problems are solved.
So in other words, what I'm saying is it's like superhero. When my players run into a challenge, what they tend to do is, okay, maybe they actually have. They've summarized their rules on how they deal with a threat they think is too powerful for them. And that summary is this: we're going to mug him in an alley. And they wait until they try to get the guy separated from any support, try to get him separated from any rescuers, and they just hit him with overwhelming force, like three muggers trying to roll a drunk. If it doesn't work, they run for their lives. And that sort of stuff. But, you have to raise an army. For example, I was talking earlier, the Skull Mountain trip where they went in and had the bleach, that was all staging to get to something called the Cavern of Herds, this massive underground cavern that has herd of miniature buffalo in it because there's sun and rain that can get into it, because there were troglodytes in there. And if you don't know, play first edition, troglodytes, they're tough. And it took them a long time, but they staged a massed heavy cavalry charge inside the dungeon to slam into the troglodyte forces and decimate them and get to the point where they could kill the chieftain and break the morale. And that's just, this was, we need to buy all the carts west of this river. We need to get all the preserved hams, and we need to buy oats because we have to stage this at the mountain and fight it. And we have to have these guys there. And with our food and light, we've got exactly 7 hours to get this done, or we've got to leave.
You'd basically never solve a challenge like that in modern gaming, although my group tries to. I mean, usually the assumption is if you're somewhere, you're supposed to be there, and the things that you're trying to fight are appropriate for your level, and there's not really any idea that you're outside of the challenge zone. I can tell one really funny story about my creative thinking. So honestly, my wizard character that I mentioned in Pathfinder is way too smart. His IQ is 300 or something because his instat is boosted. So the character is often coming up with really complex ways to sort of find interesting and novel approaches to challenges, most of which don't work because the campaign is so on rails. But I managed to come up with this thing where we were basically trying to teleport into a structure that we couldn't see in, which is actually kind of difficult because often for teleporting, you have to know where you want to go. And basically I figured out that I could summon a demon that I could communicate with, that I could tell to teleport us into a space. And
that's pretty clever.
We solved it that way, which is actually tricky because most things that you summon, you can't order specifically unless you have a shared language. So I actually found something to summon with a summon spell that I have a shared language with, who had a version of teleport that could go some number of feet through a wall. And we actually succeeded in getting this item that we're not supposed to get until way later, until actually we complete this area. And this was actually probably the most interesting thing that ever happened with the campaign, because sort of finally we had done something that could actually really impact the world in a way that is really fundamentally unintended by the campaign setting. And it's sort of way ahead of our level in terms of unlocking this thing. But I think, at least on my part, I find this really interesting because it feels like something creative is actually happening for once instead of just going along these rails, because it always feels like no matter how much we try to break the mold, we can't ever escape the bounds of what the campaign wants us to do.
It's funny that you said both creative and did something you weren't supposed to do at the same time in describing what that achievement.
Yeah, it's very indicative. It shows that you think that the only way to be creative is to do something you're not supposed to do in your campaign. And that's that's horrifying. It really is. I've got a running gag in my campaign. People have asked me on Twitter, other places, what do you do when your players derail your campaign? I'm like, they can't. I don't have any rails. Can't derail something that's not on rails.
That's that granularity. It can expand and open and unfold wherever the players want to go, because the DM is sort of running ahead, pulling the levers, operating the rods, rolling the dice, anticipating. And again, it's being driven by the players' decisions.
By the players, it's radical, and it leads to radical creativity. There's no way in hell. I mean, you mentioned you have the 300 IQ. I'm pretty smart in real life, right? I'm a clever guy. I know a lot of people a lot smarter than me. Nobody in the world is smart enough to come up with the things that come out of this collaborative system. We get a table full of people trying to figure out how to overcome a problem. Morgoth had mentioned earlier about games. It was discussing games talking about, well, this is leveled so that it'll always be appropriate for you. I know that there's a ton of people I talk to, like, we got to be really careful the challenge rating is right so that it's a tough fight, but they're going to win in D&D, meaning there's no chance of loss unless you just give up and say, kill me. That is totally foreign to me. Completely foreign to me. Absolutely. The players could wander in. Matter of fact, I've got written on my blog an example. Well, they heard some rumors from this place to the west. They heard this rumor from place to the east. All right, we're going to have the low-level guys go scout to the west. We're going to have the high-level guys go scout to the east. The high-level guys ended up killing some kobolds and saying, well, that was easy. The low-level guys ended up running from their lives from the entire Orcish army and hiding in ditches and drinking ditch water as they hoped they weren't caught and eaten because they chose poorly, and it happens. And they get back like, no, we need the A team. Where's the top dogs? And they come over this way.
Did they even choose poorly, or did they just, it just kind of happened, right? There's no way could they even
they went on the scouting mission. They did the old-fashioned thing. In the military, what does reconnaissance and force mean? It's a code word. A code phrase that means I have no objective. They decided to do a reconnaissance and force and wander around in an unknown area without really being cautious and just blundered into bad guys. So if they'd actually done scouting, they might have like, oh my gosh, it's the orcs, let's get out of here and warn people. But they're being really aggressive. And that happens sometimes. It happens in real life.
They have to be free to
make mistakes. To fail.
They have to be free to die. And that's one of the ways that as players, excuse me, and as people in life, hopefully you're going to live through your mistakes. But if you don't, that sucks. And if you do, then, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. But I wanted to ask Morgoth, because you've been listening to this, you've been sort of absorbing, presumably, this uber nerdery. Is there anything that you have seen here that you could comment upon in terms of these cycles, or are there questions you could ask from the outside to help some of us get at what sort of trajectory we might see unfolding here? Anything of that sort?
I've been a little bit lost, I'd say, if I'm honest. But I am interested in the kind of subversion and the dumbing down of the form of like what would be originally almost like a cult. Then it then becomes popular. And we see this, you don't even have to do like a Spenglerian thing. This is like seems to be the norm, whether it's the Rocky movies or whether it's all kinds of video games or whether it's Star Wars, it doesn't matter. You see this same thing play out over and over again. And you see it when Warhammer, which I'm a bit more familiar with the lore, But so what happens is you have something which is a niche market, which isn't for profit, or even interested in money so much. But then it does. And so the incentives come, and the incentive will be to dumb it down, to broaden its appeal to a mass market. And it seems to me that once it's actually reached the mass market, the mass man, it then becomes political, because it's then going to catch, or it's at least going to be a target for a political ideology being bolted onto it, or seen in political terms. And this is when you're going to have the wreckers come in and drag it straight into the dirt. The prime example that I'm aware of is which is what's going on at the moment, is the Warhammer community, where you've got people who've got like deep lore channels, and now Games Workshop's going after them for copyright, even though, and this is why somebody like Arch is like going crazy about it, because it's mainly through this organic community that it did become what it became. It was about people just discussing it and discussing the lore and playing the games, buying the miniatures, and all a sort of love for the universe, a love for the myth. And then it becomes popular. It goes to the mass man on their backs. And then, of course, once it hits the mass market, then I think Warhammer doesn't seem to have dumbed down very much, to be honest, but it became big enough where you've now got like what is it, like lady knights of the 40th millennium and all of this, like female Astartes and all of this coming to it. And so what happens is that some of the like Marvel is going to be attracted to it, but there's going to be strings attached. And just because of its nature, and I would say the nature of D&D as well, there's something in that really chaffs them and really gets their knickers in a twist, because they understand where it's coming from, and they understand what it is. They understand that it's appealing to young white men, basically, or not so young. But at any rate, it's a demographic that they don't like very much, and so there's this kind of ritual humiliation sets in. So I think in that way, gatekeeping is important. I mean, you even see it now with the pausing of Lord of the Rings. I did a bit of an angry video a month or two back, which sort of a lot of the sort of centrist nerd types didn't like very much. Got a lot of downvotes. But basically, they've spent years and years complaining about Star Wars and Star Trek. They've watched franchise after franchise go down. There's millions of them. Some of them are earning bank. Some of them have got big YouTube channels that are earning a lot of money. And they knew that sooner or later the social justice warriors would go after Tolkien. And yet there seems to be no attempts made to infiltrate the Tolkien society. It mainly set in after Christopher Tolkien died. And what I said in the video that ruffled quite a few feathers was like, instead of complaining about it on YouTube, why did nobody go into the institutions and lock it down? Or and make some kind of attempt, get in there, get into a position of influence. Instead, what we're going to get when the new Amazon thing comes out is just endless videos complaining about how it's being paused. And it's the gatekeeping thing is important. But it's kind of like, well, where do you draw the line? Because are you then going to prevent it from becoming actually becoming a mass product which could have cultural influence?
So in some sense then is D&D in a different place, because the lore is actually self-generated by the players in a way that say the Warhammer lore is kind of a canon, or Star Wars lore or Lord of the Rings lore. They all have a canon that's being directly attacked, whereas every single set of players actually has their own lore, as demonstrated by Rick's numerous stories already about how his lore works.
We do have our own lore, but we're also detached from the actual living tradition. And I think on the lines of preserving things of gatekeeping, this has been interesting for me, because I'm very interested in making sure that I actually know how to play the game, and I can pass on and teach other people how to play the game correctly and not play it the basically wrong way, not in some like silly sense, but I'm really interested in like actually preserving this tradition because I feel like it's a really important tradition for me, and I would prefer to keep it intact in its correct form. This actually touches on this idea that I want to get into before we hit the 2-hour mark, which is this idea of the second religiousness. I've noticed there's a lot of anger and argument and really serious debate over like which rule set is right, whether or not you're supposed to play like rules as written explicitly or rules as they're intended.
Right.
It kind of seems like people are trying to, like you mentioned with Jeffro, they're kind of trying to figure out indirectly, because they're detached from this living tradition, how is this thing actually played? It's almost like the Constitution, right? Like, what is the true meaning of Dungeons and Dragons? And people are very serious and very heated about figuring out what this is. So what's going on there? Like, why is this so contentious? Why is it like this religious argument, basically?
I want to throw in just one piece, which is democratization. There's a famous quote by Lester Maddox, who was a very controversial political figure in Georgia back in the day. And somebody came to him and they said that they're having these terrible problems in these prisons. And Lester Maddox, as was very much his style, just flippantly replied, "Well, we're going to keep having these problems till we get a better class of people in there." And it's a sort of sword that cuts two ways. In the one sense, obviously, it's only going to be as good as the people involved, which is the great downfall of pure democracy. But in the other sense, it was sort of hinting that that if you want to straighten things out, put a higher class of people in there who probably need to go to jail. But most people, I think, miss that double entendre. But that's part of the problem, is that the game is the product of the players who are playing it at any given time, isn't it?
It is, and there's some published settings that have come out there where they've got lore. You've got Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms are two big ones. Forgotten Realms was official for a long time, Eberron. And this sort of decline in politicization that you see, or talking about, you see in this official stuff that comes out of the system. You see it going from the original creator, although I'm not shy at all saying that I never liked Forgotten Realms, and I don't think Ed Greenwood's a very good writer, but Forgotten Realms was extremely popular for a long time, and it got dumber and dumber and more simplified and more dumbed down over time until now it's like looking at references on Family Guy is all that's left. You know, little flashback scenes to characters from stuff. It's gotten really goofy and weird. Now, I'm sure they're making money off of it, and again, I don't begrudge people paying the mortgage, but it went from this very sort of open, here's some interesting things, and I prefer high-level play. My Mary Sue self-insert is really awesome, isn't it cool, to, oh my gosh, this is another reason why you should buy the 7-book cycle so you can catch up on the lore before you can play this module, and I don't care for it. But the vast majority of stuff going out there is like mine, where we're making it, we're recording it, we're passing it on, and there's really no way for me to do this. I'm in the process of collating all my house rules. The published house rules I have 2 copies of the stuff that's just different from D&D. It's about 190 pages. So it's not nothing. And it's everything from the sets of weights and measures that I use in game, which are different than the Imperial measures, actually, to particulars of language. One of my sons does con langs, and he's been working on constructed languages for a long time. But I'm considering writing a sort of a pastiche of, here's all the rules of first edition with my changes, so that it's one massive tome rather than just my add-on. Don't know why I'm doing it. It's just for fun. But I've had people come to me and say, you should really write down Seaward, your campaign, and sell it. And I've got 3 real big problems with that one. One, don't want to. Is probably the biggest and most important. I don't want to because, of course, I think that in some ways it would lock it down. As it is, in order to sell it to other people, I would have to take some of the secrets that I still have only in my head and only in notebooks and put them out there for everybody. 2, I don't think that I could. I've got something approaching 75 college notebooks full of notes, and my digital files I've got kept in 3 different clouds is at about 60 megs each, just as my notes and maps. And last but not least, I'm very concerned about this very thing. If I publish this and put this out into the wild, will it get away from me so I can't keep control of it anymore and maintain that level of quality that I want?
Well, I think I think you're kind of getting to the right answer there. Is, I mean, the only real way in which your campaign, I guess, can exist is through the playing of the campaign. And like,
Right.
if you just publish it and other people pick it up, just as I've picked up D&D from 3rd edition onward, it just wouldn't, it would be detached. It's like, there's you can't actually codify the organic nature of the tradition in books and then recreate it. I had mentioned in my notes, this reminds me of the initiative by Mark Brahman and others to like recreate the cult of Apollo. And I think a lot of us believe that you simply can't take from what has been written about this tradition that used to exist and just sort of fabricate it out of nothing and then try and inhabit. It's kind of like inhabiting the corpse of this thing. Like, you can't, in my opinion, you can't codify the tradition itself and then just pick it up as if the organic and like spiritual aspect of the thing didn't matter. There's something inherent in the tradition being passed from one generation to another that once it's lost, it actually can't be brought back. And that's really where this mass democratization of Dungeons and Dragons and intentional subversion is so dangerous, because if campaigns like yours cease, there's no actual getting back to that. There's like a dwindling amount of like real continuing Dungeons and Dragons tradition that's going on in the future. And I don't think there is any way in which you can simply, there's no amount of words you can write on a paper that can actually preserve that outside of people participating in it.
That's the difference between something that is score-based and something that is improvisational, coming out of a living tradition that I was trying to tap on earlier. It could also be described as, it could also be described as the difference between something being undead and something being immortal. And once it gets locked down as a text, then you can call it pilpul, you can call it hermeneutics, you can. It's the ability to come in and say, well, no, those words don't actually mean what you think they mean. And that's what happens when you no longer have sort of a living guardian of whatever the tradition is. You could also think of it as like in the historical European martial arts groups, that are trying to reconstruct swordplay and all that kind of stuff. They're forced to like deal with the fiore or whatever, or these 17th century fencing manuals that still exist with weird geometric patterns on the floor, but they don't remember what they are. So it's almost like the difference between a book and something like a sensei. And I think this is a really important meta question overall, because it's the idea, how do you say, it's institutions, right? It goes back to the Latin with stet for stand, right? To raise something up. You raise a stele, you raise something like Hammurabi's code on a standing stone. You put up the revolving cylinders of Solon's codes, right? And at that point, it's instituted because it will stand, it will stay, like the editor's mark, stet, let it stand. All those come from the same root. And so when you have a text, you have the basis of an institution that can develop over time. As soon as that text is fixed, it tends to ossify once the people involved in its creation have died. And that's the point at which you get everyone coming out and doing what I call their hadith. In the Muslim tradition, you have to track back this statement about Muhammad and who first heard it from Muhammad. And he repeated it to Ali bin such and such, who repeated it to Hassan bin so-and-so. And it's come down to us from this chain of transmission. And I saw that in some of the back and forth going on with you, Rick, and some of the other people, Jethro, some of those folks who came in that Twitter thread. Everybody's talking about Arneson and what he said, and Gygax and what he said. And I'm thinking to myself, well, what about what I say? And that's because I was a part, relatively late, coming in by the time of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I was sort of like the late part of the early phase. But But when it gets fixed as a text, that's the point at which it ossifies and it's no longer alive, and it becomes sort of this canon. And so perhaps one of the keys to gatekeeping is sort of that old tradition of a sensei. You know, I was trained under such and such in the school of so-and-so. I don't just quote the texts, but I had the experience, you know.
I've had 3 bishops lay their hands on me when I was ordained. Yeah.
Right. That kind of thing.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when we were talking about this, and Charlemagne was talking about this, what hit me was, are we talking about mistaking accidents for essence? You know, I'm going to go all scholastic here. You know, there's a sort of essence to what it is to play D&D. And then there's the accidents on the outside. And I see, and it was brought to my mind when Charlemagne was talking about that, because it made me think, I know people on various social media that I know that have hundreds of dollars worth of dice. They've bought the special D&D dice. They've got crystal, they've got metal, they've got, you know, non-Euclidean liquid. I mean, you name it. They've got an amazing sets of dice. And I was talking to this young woman who collects them, and I said, well, how often do you play? She goes, well, I've never played.
Oh, wow.
That's the whole side subject of the collectors, you know, the people with 2 full rooms full of their man stuff they've collected. You know, and they don't play the games. But they've got all of it first edition, and don't open it. Make sure it stays in its Mylar cover.
It's in the original case. Well, she loves the essence of the dice of D&D, but she doesn't. The accidents of the dice in D&D. She loves that accident, but she's not involved in the essence of D&D in any way. Now, I'm not saying she's not having fun. I'm sure she's having fun, but there's a mistake there. You're mistaking one for the other, and I think that a lot of what we're talking about. I mean, Spengler himself talks about that in one of his books. There's this mistake. We over time, the essence of something is lost, and we start ritualizing the accidents of it, and then we mistake the accidents for the essence, and that's part of the degradation of things over time. And I think that's something we're seeing.
So I must take my leave now because I have family time to get to. Thanks very much for the excellent discussion. And I'll catch up with the rest of the stream. As always, subscribe to Skeptical Waves for based audiobooks.
Thank you very much. Waves.
All right, thanks, guys. Bye.
Now, Morgoth, I think you were about to chime in right there as well.
Yeah. So what the idea of collecting the dice is, as Rick was saying, it's like in the sort of the late civilizational phase, there's a thing comes in where people begin to look for trinkets, and they begin to with the sort of bourgeoisie middle class types, and they begin to fetishize sort of the esoteric, but from different places in the world, and it's a sort of virtue signal, as if to say they aren't just materialists, because at that stage of the civilization, it will be very materialist. And what actually happens is that because we're talking about late stage here, the Caesarism stage comes in, and then that kind of second religiousness it kind of becomes a much more serious form, and you see that the later Roman Empire emperors actually did bring back the old gods in an unironic and serious way. Except it's kind of stiffened, and it's a little bit it's got arthritis, and it's a little bit, but it still actually works. And the weird thing is, you get the effects of religion as well. You get this like the birth rates increase and stuff like that. So it is actually genuine and not the kind of fake of buying the trinkets with some kind of spiritual value, which you're kind of putting onto it, and so it is like a real thing, and they do go back to they do kind of resurrect, but we aren't even close to that yet, or it could be just on the way.
Interesting thing on that is they actually just reprinted a lot of the older books. I think the first edition books, if I recall, or it might have been Advanced D&D, they re-released officially the old books in this like collector's format, perhaps to facilitate this type of authentic, in some sense, like recreation of the original form.
But you always have the risk of the cargo cult. Sorry, Morgoth, this be very fast. You know, the whole thing of the islanders sitting up on top of the mountain with their airplanes made out of straw. burning fires and waiting for the great white man in the sky to deliver goods to them. They've turned it into a cult, and they only understand those accidents or those outward forms. And that seems to be some of what's going on at present. But sorry, Morgoth.
I was just going to say it's similar to like in Star Wars, collecting the Star Wars figures. Like nobody wants a Padme or a Rey figure, but everybody wants like a Han Solo original or the original Darth Vader. So it has a kind of specialness to it that the later stuff hasn't, and that's kind of a similar thing where you want the original. So if it's possible that that's a direction D&D can go in, that I don't know. I mean, it doesn't seem to happen in pop culture by and large.
Well, I do know that the original books as PDFs sell very well to this day, and those collector's editions that he was mentioned, they sold out very fast. My kids got me a set of them as a gift, and there's more hunger for that stuff too. I think that since it's more like a sport in some ways, this might, last a bit longer than it otherwise would. I don't know.
It seems like people understand there's something wrong with the game.
Yeah.
Like in a very deep way, but they're unable to like articulate what it is. So they're just sort of like going back because they know it was better before. They don't know how, but it's like, if we just get this before stuff, somehow that's going to fix the situation, even though we don't actually understand like what's wrong. I think you see that a lot. I mean, again, in Star Wars, you see that where it's like you see that with like the Mandalorian, I think, where something is wrong with new Star Wars, but if we just like go back and try to like literally just temporally go back to like Empire, whatever,
I was
it'll be better.
I remember because obviously the prequels came out, and then when it was like 2015, I knew the Jar Jar Abrams. I knew it was a big sellout. I knew it was going to be rubbish. I never had any kind of enthusiasm for it at all, even though I'm like a Star Wars kind of kid, of that age. But what I wanted, and this actually happened in the video game versions, where people were going way back, because the video games and the deep lore wasn't as constrained as like the Hollywood. And what caught on was people going way back in the lore, like thousands and thousands of years before all of the things that happened in what we think of as Star Wars, and where you would get like Darth Raven and Darth Bane and how the Sith were created and how you got the rule of two. And so in the actual, the genuine fan base, and there was like computer games coming out on this. So in like the actual fan base, it was not about making this rubbish that came out, but about like digging, kind of going full esoteric, like deeper and deeper into the lore in a way which wouldn't suit the mass audience, which a product like Star Wars is catering to. So that the actual fan base were like, no, we need to go all the way back and find out like how the Sith happened. What was the split between the Jedi and the Sith in the first place? Of course, that's just too much for Hollywood. It's too much for them to take on. So they had to just basically recreate, do like a postmodern version of the original trilogy.
It's an interesting take. Yeah, I mean, I feel about the same. When they were coming out with 5th edition, they tried to sort of co-opt something called the OSR. I'm not part of the OSR. I've always said so very clearly. The OSR, old school revival, old school renaissance, old school resurgence, is, and this is one of those words where there's 7,000 definitions for what the phrase means from 7,000 people. To me, it's a bunch of people who didn't actually play back then, that know there's something missing and want to capture what it was like to play back then. And they're sort of, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, they're sort of LARPing it. They're doing their best to go back and recreate it. It's like that craze we had in the mid-90s for swing bands, where you could go downtown, put on your zoot suit, and there's a big band playing jazz. There's a lot of nostalgia for it. And I think that a lot of these guys know that there's something missing or trying to capture it. But at the same time, most of them, and again, they're having fun, are doing a lot more to emulate the culture now and trying to tack on what they think the mechanical rules were from then. And that's the opposite of the difference. The difference is not about the mechanical rules. The difference is about the culture and the attitude towards play and towards players and how things work. That's what's changed, and that's what's been lost. And when Wizards and Hasbro were like, we're coming out with this new one, and it's going to be just like old times. They brought in the OSR, they released the original books again, and I think they just missed the point. So,
one thing we actually haven't touched on, but that is contentious in Dungeons and Dragons, is the whole idea of race. Because when you play the game, you select a race, and the races have certain traits that define and restrict them. And we mentioned orcs. I'm actually looking at my 5th edition player's handbook now. Human is a race in the game. The depiction of the human is actually an African woman, which is pretty interesting. Yeah. Does anyone have any thoughts? Have you researched like some of the contention around like this whole idea of races and racial traits in Dungeons and Dragons and how people react to this?
It strikes me as really strange, and it's always struck me as strange. Nobody thought about this as anything other than what it is at the time. And I think that to some extent, the loss of connection to folklore and fairy tales has a lot to do with it. We used to have this concept that was fairly classical. Morgoth, I'm not sure which of the Gaelic countries or Celtic countries you're from, but I don't know if it's still true there, but with a lot of my family coming from Germany, I grew up with a lot of folk tales in German, tales of German spooks and stuff. And then reading a great deal of medieval literature and early literature coming in. And to me, an ogre is, of course, this completely inhuman thing that eats people and often has magical powers. I knew what a bugbear was. A bugbear is this creature that lurks in the dark and eats children when they're naughty. And they're not human, right? And the distinctive feature of them is they're not human. The stories of the elves, from everything from Jack Vance's stuff to Tolkien, is they're other, very different. Same with dwarves, the very German, the dwarves and the gnomes, that sort of stuff. So when I was coming into it originally, this was not, they couldn't be races. If you wanted to play a black person or a white person or, whatever, as a human, nobody cared, because why would they? Same thing. Well, I had a friend of mine. Well, I think, dwarves are underground a lot and around the forges a lot. I think my dwarf should have black skin. Okay, who cares? And it wasn't until much later, when we're in the era of things are sideways, we've forgotten how to play, and suddenly we're very focused on the accents, not the essence. There's this idea of, well, of course it has to be a stand-in for something else. Well, why would it? It is a stand-in for something else. You got to stand in for horrible monsters that eat people in the dark. That's what you're fighting. That's what an orc just means: fear of the unknown, the savagery of untamed wilderness. Has nothing to do with people. What has something to do with people? Well, it just always confused me.
I think there's a few problems with that though, because if you take sort of the fantasy, if you take elves and you take orcs, it's all very European. So yeah. if you say the orc is the other, then by definition it's the other from a European perspective. So the problem they have with all of this is that it isn't universal, and this is like literally what the social justice, white privilege, all of this, that is what they'll say. They'll say that it's Eurocentric, meaning that like sort of we are in the middle of this. It's from our perspective. And so, I mean, the idea that a sort of blonde elf is the other would seem mind-boggling to them, but it's other to us. And this is just when they look Europeans. It takes on a whole other difference when they are looking at what they, in their kind of lefty jargon, they would say the othering of like out groups and things like that. Then it becomes much more problematic, as they would say, when it's centered from Europeans, because it's how we are describing basically the outsiders, and it may not be racially specific, but the form is one of aggression and barbarity and this kind of thing. So they catch on to that like straight away.
Yeah,
well, it doesn't. Again, I'm about to say I do have to go to, like right now, but again, this is akin to saying that disliking being bitten by mosquitoes is a code for something. I don't buy it. I just don't like being bitten by biting insects. There is no meta narrative there. There is nothing else going on there. And if I turn that into a creature in D&D called a Sturge that is a big super mosquito, it's just because I don't like mosquitoes. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. That's my perspective. As you guys can tell, I do have to let you go. Thank you so much for having me on. It meant a lot, and I look forward to speaking to you all again soon.
Awesome.
Yeah, Rick, thank you very, very much for joining us. You certainly you cast a long shadow across my limited experience. So it was very good to have you on as a subject matter expert and participant.
Well, thank you again. Have a good guys. Have a good one, guys.
All right, have a good one.
Take care.
All right. Well, I think that means we can probably wrap up soon. I do want to comment, though. I think this idea that the game doesn't make any sense outside of a European perspective, because all of the lore, as we mentioned in Appendix N, it's really based on this Eurocentric lore. And there are settings and worlds that are more Asian or African, but those never, to me, feel fundamental to the game. What we were talking about reminded me of an experience I had in the Rise of Rune Lords campaign again. Basically, we're infiltrating this troll dungeon, right? And there's trolls in there. They're sort of the main enemy. Actually, I think it's stone giants, but whatever. Basically, stone giants are bad guys, and we need to beat them. And we're in this dungeon, right? And we're trying to go to the big king stone giant and defeat him. And at some point, we come across this this female stone giant, and she starts talking to us and basically gives us information and helps us take down this tyrant monarch. And my reaction was just like, well, this is really weird, because why would you talk to a stone giant? The stone giants are just strictly the bad guy, the enemy. You would never talk with one, and it would never help you undermine its own race, basically. This random party of wizard, half elf or elf and human comes in, and this stone giant just starts helping us overthrow her own society. That's just really bizarre to me.
Highly intersectional, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's I can't imagine that this would make sense in if Tolkien were to play the game or whatever, right? That would never happen. There's never this idea where, Sauron's orc is going to actually this one orc is going to help you find, how to get in and throw the one ring into the volcano, whatever. The races are strictly especially the races outside of the player character races that cooperate, the half elves and humans and dwarves, etc. Outside of the civilized races, these guys are purely bad guy. And the idea that you would just speak the language of common with one, and this giant would help you defeat another giant is kind of bizarre to me.
Yeah, well, you do have the alignments, so there is considerable room and for developing plot twists or turns or directions, ways things that can happen that involve cooperation to some extent. For example, you could get some quote unquote monster to assist you if there's some shared goal, but then they might turn around and stab you in the back once it's been figured out, that kind of thing. To me, it's much more about not having it be a damn mud pie. It's enough to have a pastiche, but to take 15 or 20 of them from all over the place and just stir them together has never been my thing. And so, you could look and say, well, there's something sort of fundamentally European about this group of, Rick was talking earlier about how it comes out of these canons, this canon of books. They mentioned things like, Jack Vance. I don't remember what's on the list, but I guess it's things like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse, or, you certainly saw things in Deities and Demigods where you've got the Melnibonéan mythos, from the Michael Moorcock books. So whatever it is, have it feel internally consistent And that's probably at least one part of what you're talking about, Charlemagne, is that there's no internal consistency in the idea that your terrible enemy is just going to be like, well, let's, kick back, let's pop a beer together because we're all oppressed. It's just not going to happen.
Sorry, go on, Charlemagne.
I was just going to mention, we didn't bring up the good evil alignment axis. Like in the monster manual or bestiary, classes of creature like orc or giant or whatever, they're strictly evil, and like the idea that one would not be evil is kind of anathema. Like you would basically never do that.
I was just reminded, I don't know how I just want to tell a little story before we wrap it up, because I was looking at I was looking for some pictures for something, and on the subject of grim dark, and I stumbled across this blog just called Grim Dark. It's like some obscure little thing. But the writer, I clicked on it, and the writer was writing a response to like sort of feminists on social justice types, and the gist of it was that they were the lefties were complaining about how women are depicted in dystopian, well, just generally that dystopian movies. They're not very politically correct, and they zoomed in on Blade Runner 2049 and said it objectified women. This is complete rubbish, because the except for the main character who's in all of those memes, all of the main characters in the movie are female. But like, just leave that to one side for a second. And so they were saying that it was objectifying women, and his kind of blog post, I just stumbled across it by accident. And he'd said that, well, yeah, but that's the point. It's a dystopia. Like, why is it that you liberal progressives, why is it that, like, you expect your value system to be in a dystopia? And I thought it was really interesting because, like, we on the right have no problem envisioning sort of dystopian. We do it too much. Like we're even if it's like a sort of global homo future, or if it's the Mad Max type future, or of like complete collapse, it doesn't matter. Like, we are very comfortable with dystopias, even if our values aren't represented in them. But to the liberal progressives, like, even when they envisage a future dystopian scenario, they still have to shoehorn their own values in there. So they can't have a dystopia, for example, where like the far right wins and they are living under some like Uber-based kind of racist, from their perspective, what would be a dystopia. And they can't do that. They can go back in the past and kind of impose, and say how horrible it all was. But for some reason, because it's progressivism and future looking, they always have to assume that even if the future is awful, there'll still be feminism there. Even like, how can they possibly envisage a dystopia then if their values are always going to be there, even at the end of the world? Do you see the weird kind of paradox here?
Yes, and there's a sort of nested aspect of it that I'm trying to get my head around. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something.
Well, it's almost like it's almost like if you're in the dystopia and you have these liberal ideas, it's like, well, did the liberal ideas get you there? Like, is that where
and the dystopia itself is, I mean, for a right winger, the vast majority of the dystopian situations all come out of the archetype, which is the present, which is the imposition of leftist ideals. So in some senses, perhaps they're right. Their ideals will always be present in a utopia.
Like their take on Blade Runner 49 should be that it's offensive because there's so much feminism in it. Because then they can say, "Oh, this is just making feminism look bad." This like, by implication, having women's in positions of power and influence means that we're going to descend into this like transhumanist, like industrial hellscape and all of this kind of thing. And I think I may do my own video on this, because I think it's quite mind bending that even in a dystopian scenario, their values have to win out.
Yeah,
there's really interesting.
The piece I was just trying to articulate there's something about the battlefield. There's a book I recommend to everybody. I do it all the time. It's a bit of a dense read, but it's not that big a book. It's certainly not a dense read compared to stuff like Heidegger, which I heard you mention in your last video, Morgoth. But it's by this guy, Ioan Culianu from Romania, and he escaped the Ceausescu regime. And he studied this whole thing about the imagination and images across a period of European historical development. And I can't get into all of it, but basically towards the end of his book, he points out that there was an efflorescence of the imagination, and then there was the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. And compared to like the Renaissance humanists and Neoplatonists and Hermeticists, both the Reformation and the reactionary Catholic Counter-Reformation basically went to war against images. And it's a very interesting thing that he pointed out, the way in which the imagination was sort of flattened. And so you have the introduction of logic and, you know, a focus on mathematics and symbolic representations that aren't icons, that aren't images, that aren't representations of that sort. So there's even sort of a vague sense of a kind of iconoclasm to it. But the point is that the imagination was weaponized. And so this very interesting author, Culianu, he's looking at Renaissance mages and Hermeticists, and he's sort of tracking a direct line of descent down to the modern advertising man and propagandist and the way they weaponize the imagination. I point that out only to suggest that there's a long sort of historical background for this that can be explored, which is about the imagination and the degree in which it's allowed to sort of flower. You know, like in Islam, they'll remove representational images. So you'll see like the scratched out faces of figures, or they'll take away the Buddhist statues because that representative kind of art isn't permitted. You see that in Judaism as well, which is why you see temples and things decorated with geometric figures instead of like in a Catholic church with statues. Anyway, all that by way of saying that the imagination is a battleground. And there's something, like I said, I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something about leftists and their projection, which is fundamentally anti-natural. It's this utopian superimposition, this never-ending cry of, if only things were different and we can make them so, even manifestation and nature itself. And so given that projection and the weaponization of the imagination, this living in a projected parallel reality at all times, it's not even parallel, this living in this anti-reality that's projected at all times, and the imagination being the battlefield, it would seem to explain why there is so much concern for carrying the warfare to the land of video games, carrying the warfare to the land of movies, carrying the warfare to the realm of images that is in some sense I hope that I don't sound too crazy, but there are strictly speaking, Neoplatonic arguments that set forth the idea that the realm of images is ontologically prior to manifestation. So if you can shape the images that people will then apply to whatever circumstances they encounter, you've shaped their experience of the world itself. And so maybe that explains why the leftists have all these weird paradoxes going on in terms of what they imagine, how they apply it, but it would also explain why they go after video games and movies and literature and artwork and sculpture and just try to shit all over everything, including role-playing games.
Yep.
Let me tell one more quick story, which I think is interesting and gets on the stark good and evil and racist point again as well. So like in the campaign I was running, basically the civilized and good races are in the north and the evil ones are in the south. And the campaign basically opens with like an orc army sort of surprising the complacent northern societies. So the player characters are in this situation where they fight the orc army. And my brother was playing with us for the first time, and I allowed him to play an orc, which is really weird because normally, like I said, orcs are just strictly evil. Basically, like players are allowed to play monster races, but it's kind of suggests that you really shouldn't because it kind of doesn't make any sense. And I let him do it though because he played it basically straight, where the orc was only working with the players and willing to fight other orcs because his whole goal was just to get the best fight possible, right? He wanted to fight. He would even betray the players for almost no reason just to get a good fight out of it, right? So what happens is that my brother will basically just send him into the orc camp, and he just sort of waltzes into the army camp of the orcs and goes and talks directly to the leader. And the implication here is just that other orcs would never question why this other orc that they haven't necessarily seen is in the camp, because he's just an orc, right? If a member of your race is here in your group, well, obviously he's just on the same side. Like, there's no question that he can just walk around and do what anyone else would want, because, of course the orc is with the orcs, right? But in this case, he wasn't. Whereas, I think obviously a modern player, or especially really a progressive player, would have a serious issue with this. The idea that, well, what's wrong with an orc being a player character, right? But the rules themselves come into conflict with this ideology, because they still very much specify that certain races are like just this way. Like, you can't have a werewolf that's not a bad guy. You can't have a vampire that's not a bad guy. It's kind of outside of the framework of like what these creatures are fundamentally.
And that's the alignment that you brought up.
Yeah, alignment. Everything in the game has an alignment of good, neutral, evil, and you really are strongly encouraged not to break this, right?
Well, eBay is a DM, God, I sound like the nerd of all nerds. Speaking as a DM, you have to track the alignment and whether or not the players are in conformity with it. And if they're not, you're a cleric, you start to drift from alignment, you lose your spells, you get kicked out, by your deity, and you got maybe one chance to have another deity take you with a corresponding shift in alignment, maybe loss of powers and levels. If you're a paladin, you're screwed. There are many things like that, and most people don't pay attention to them. I mean, I think one thing that was pointed out by Rick talking about his notebooks and the megabytes of data online and all that kind of stuff is that you produce an enormous amount of material to try to remember the adventures, and you have to make notes, and there's all kinds of record keeping involved. There's just a lot of work in paying attention and doing it right, and there are just very few people who are qualified to do it. And I learned the basics of this. I mean, I was fairly good at it by the time I was 12. So I'm not trying to throw attitude. A competent 12-year-old can manage it. But even so, these days, it's that same Lester Maddox line. We're going to keep having these same damn problems until we get better class people in here.
Cool. Well, just one last thing is, I've criticized, I guess, some things a lot. I do just want to say, the DM that I know who actually runs the Pathfinder campaign I've mentioned, he's a good DM, right? So, but it's very much like the setting itself that sort of mutually frustrates us sometimes, including the dungeon master, right? Like the constraints laid out from the setting are constraining to all of us in ways that we don't particularly like. And we often have discussions after games about like what we can mutually do to improve this. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Especially since he'll probably listen.
Right on. Yeah, you don't want to get yourself, backstabbed there by an angry DM on a rampage. Well, before we wrap this up, Morgoth, was there anything final you wanted to cover or mention that you didn't have a chance to do?
Oh no, I mean, if it comes to the topic of like sort of fantasy and fictional worlds, I can prattle on all day. I don't really know much about D&D, but never mind. I'm happy. A nice, relaxing stream for a change.
Right on. Well, thank you very much for being willing to come in and field all this stuff that you're not directly familiar with. I appreciate it. And Charlemagne, thank you very much for the idea and for making arrangements and things to get folks on. I guess I've covered D&D, and I'm very happy to have done so on September 11th rather than talking about anything directly political rather than meta political. So yeah, very interesting to me. Happy to have everybody on. I want to remind everybody who's watching, there are links for everybody for all the people who were guests today down in the description. Please do follow Morgoth's channel. If you're not already, please follow Charlemagne's. Go check out Skeptical Waves channel. And thanks again to our guest, Rick Stump, the subject matter expert. There is a link to his blog, and apparently he is pretty active talking to people. I saw that on Twitter. He's knowledgeable and very connected to things. So if anybody wants to reach out to him, you can reach him through his blog. So thanks to everyone. That is it for now. And until next time, I am Semiagog, and I am out.